Well, you should have interrupted sooner because then we could have recorded more. But thank you for pointing that out, Joe. We had some wonderful exchanges with Pete, Lane, and Craig, but
Well, I was
we only
watching
started
it all,
recording
but
now.
just I like to watch these things more than once. And
Well,
I enjoy your
there you go.
YouTube channel very much, especially your interactions with the AI system.
Okay. Yes. Well, I
I'm a
especially
great
enjoy my
fan.
interactions with you guys instead. But sure, do check it out. But thanks for pointing that out. And some things are special for only those people that show up, apparently. So the recording will not have everything. Um, it's appropriate for the age of the world picture, I guess. Dan.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Thank you.
Uh, Regarding this, I didn't read the book, It's Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature by Rorty, but I think that's where he takes our Heidegger argument and develop it fall into a book. And I'm planning to read that book, but I think it's along the lines that you just discussed. And so regarding this, so I read this book about 3 years ago. I'm rereading it now. And since then, I think I read a lot of Heidegger and also reread most of Nietzsche. And it's quite interesting to now take it slowly and don't rush and enjoy everything. And I think Heidegger is trying here to cover a lot, keep it simple. I noticed that like he tries to keep it very simple and to cover put in a lot of stuff, like a lot of ideas, and try to, I don't know, take us along a path and say, look, that's wrong. Don't go with me there, but then just to convince you that it's not the right way. And I really like that. And well, now I remember I read at some point his correspondence with Arendt, and I think he says something like, like he was banned from teaching, and they allow him to return. And it seems like there were a lot of people there, like thousands wanted to take his class, and they broadcast it. I think it was this class. And then, of course, after this, they force him to retire. And I'm not saying it's, but it's kind of the context there in the background that he's returning and then he being forced to retire.
Pete may have more context on that, but understood. Certainly, this was a largely awaited thing. In terms of the so I'm going to partly agree with Craig that this is kind of meandering, right? And partly for the reason you gave, that he's addressing a lot of expected objections, which if you don't have, just seem aimless, right? And there's always a certain amount of that at the start of any Heidegger, course or lecture, that he'll, what I call the throat clearing section, where he brings up three or four possible objections to what he's about to do, and gives them their due for a paragraph or two at most, and then moves on. And I always call that his throat clearing, right? He's got to show that he recognized the critics exist, but shut them up so he can go talk about what he wants to talk about, right? But here you got like 4 lectures of throat clearing, right? Because there's a lot of potential objections. It's not quite fair because he is also making some progress along the way, but it's like every step he's pausing to throat clear, right? In these 4 chapters particularly, I think these are slower than the stuff in the later part of the last 2, and also all of part 2, most of part 2 at least, and certainly then 4, the tree and bloom section. So in that way, it can feel like a little bit of a trough in the pacing of the book. Although part of that depends upon whether or not some of those objections he is addressing are ones that one has oneself, right? If those are alive for you, then him addressing them may be particularly helpful. But if they're things which are completely remote from us, then maybe not. You can also ask whether or not his treatment of all the things he's rejecting is just, right? I mean, some of them are treated pretty flippantly, and there are, especially because here he's in the process of, we talked about this, assimilating Nietzsche. He winds up both castigating people for misunderstanding Nietzsche, and then presenting a Nietzsche that this is an understanding of, that, as Pete points out, he's not going to agree with himself, right? So he can't sell it too hard, so to speak. But if he oversells it, there's a possible misstep there too. So it's definitely a minefield that he's walking through to set up what his take is going to be on Nietzsche metaphysics in this time context, etc. And we can talk more about what some of those things are along the way. I think there's a definite sort of thesis or framing he's aiming at in these 4 chapters that sets up the last 2, which is basically the box he's putting Nietzsche in. He wants Nietzsche to be read primarily as a metaphysician and almost someone who's in a tradition of religious thinking or religious and philosophical thinking, rather than as someone who is thought of as a moralist or a politician, right? And that shift in framing is necessary for his diagnosis of metaphysical thinking and what he reads into the deliverance from the spirit of revenge stuff that we're going to get the next time. And here he's setting all that up, but he has to go through all the other understandings of Nietzsche as being primarily an anti-religious thinker, as being primarily a political thinker, as being primarily a moralist, something like that, or even as a historicist kind of thinker, relativist thinker, right? None of those are the things being stressed here, which are often associated with Nietzsche. Joe.
Always have to find how to turn on my voice. I enjoyed very much these readings. I read them all pretty quickly last week. I like to hear you characterize much of what this throat clearing was. I detected it sort of as underbrush that you had to sort of kick your way through. I appreciated the fact that he was explicating Nietzsche, as if Nietzsche were a very complex poem, and you had to have a expert walk you through it. That's very clear pretty much when you try to read how obscure it is. There's a few of the concepts, like the passing over from the last man to the overman, and that was, I sort of got it, but it wasn't very clear what Zarathustra was really all about. But I did appreciate that he brought out in the last lecture part something about overcoming revenge. And the thing that he's taking revenge against apparently is the detail that time passes away. And we remember things from then, and we don't update our behavior toward what's really coming at us from the future. But it became very obscure. I was glad that Heidegger was laying it out. The part I liked the best, I think, in the chapters, each chapter, is after he's sort of described Nietzsche, he gives you the transition and the interpretation. That's very helpful. I get to see better, I think, where he's going. And I have read ahead to the next to the last of the section 1 to try to see if I can get more out of it. And you get feelings for it, but I'm still very confused, and I'm looking forward to Jason telling me what it's all about.
Well, yes, we'll definitely talk about it. So good to know that you've read ahead there. I mean, definitely the spirit of the revenge, and whether or not the spirit of revenge is a matter of metaphysics rather than just morals, is kind of what 9 and 10 are going to be about. By the end of 8, he's laid on us that that man be delivered from the spirit of revenge is Nietzsche's highest hope, according to the passages in Zarathustra. But he has not explained how that could be something which ties together Nietzsche's thought in a bow, right? Or how that could be the key to interpreting the interrelationship of all of these different ideas of the figure of Zarathustra and the idea of the last man or the overman and the idea of the eternal return of the same, and what all these things have to do with one another, right? And how is not only how are they all related, but what is even the ground on which they are related? On its surface, to be delivered from the spirit of revenge sounds like a moral wish, right? A pious moral wish, something like that. But to Heidegger, it is not. To Heidegger, it's saying something about metaphysics. But that winds up implicating something that could be seen as being at the root of morals in metaphysics, or vice versa. Metaphysics itself may have implications for the root of morals, put it something like that. We'll get more about what that actual ground is in the discussion of 9 and 10, but here he's just setting that up, right? First of all, compared to the conventional understanding of Nietzsche as a will to power, a go team, right? Will is good, will to power is better. a moralist, something like that, to say that this pious wish to be delivered from the spirit of revenge is the core of Nietzsche's thought is meant to shift people away from that interpretation. It sounds like something that a teacher of repentance says. It sounds like something that a theologian says. It doesn't sound like something that a cynical Machiavellian politician says, right? And that shift in ground is necessary to set up the fact that he's going to talk about metaphysics, not politics, in 9 and 10. But so far he's just setting that up. I realize you've read ahead to more of the punchline. But all of that is, at the end of 87, where he says, the question of revenge and its overcoming is no doubt important, but it's still quite remote from the question of what is. The question of revenge is that, after all, not the question of being. So this is the objection he's putting to the mouth of the audience of how they would be understanding up to this point. And then he says, let us see, let us start thinking. So he's going to try to disprove those understandings of what the question of revenge is actually about in 9 and 10. Okay. Nathan, first reactions. Did you manage to do the reading and first reactions to any of it?
Yeah, I did. I did the reading. It was some time last week. I have to admit, I went back and listened to some of the Nietzsche lectures that are on your website, and now I'm trying to figure out what I took away from that versus what I took away from my reading. So I guess at first reactions, Pete said a lot of it, I think, for me, but I was struck by, in a number of places where it seemed like he was really, in the political stuff, it seemed like he was taking a shot at the National Socialists a number of times throughout in the lectures. So I wasn't exactly sure about the time frame of when these lectures were happening.
Early 50s, 52, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, so I was a little bit, oh, okay. That's kind of my experience, was like, and then it seemed like he was I was trying to figure out what the connection to the fundamental question is, right? What is thinking, and how it relates to that. So I was kind of picking up that he was agreeing with Nietzsche, I guess, in some sense, that about the characterization of maybe the last man, and that somehow that Nietzsche is also going to be an impediment to thinking in some way. And so that's where I was left wondering, kind of where he's going.
Yeah, fair. So because there's this complex thing of he's agreeing with him in part and he's going to disagree with him eventually. Yes, so that's all very complicated, right? You're right that there are places in here where he has definite brickbats that are aimed at National Socialism. There's also places where he has definite brickbats which are aimed at liberalism, where he has definite brickbats aimed at modernity as such, right? Or at scientism. There's any number of reigning interpretations of the time and political forces from the 30s to that day that are coming in for criticism, some in the voice of Nietzsche and some in his own voice. He says some things here which are, on the dangerous side, if I can put it that way. Quoting with apparent approval, Nietzsche talking about the will to have institutions requires something which is anti-liberal to the point of malice, right? And quoting that sort of thing with seeming approval. He does want to he wants to steer people away from interpretations of Nietzsche as a power politician, something like that. But at the same time, he says things like World War II decided nothing, only what was left undecided stands out a little bit more clearly, or that points about tradition and anti-liberal to the point of malice, right? So it's not unambiguous what he's saying here. Most of these things are said from the standpoint, if I can put it this way, of a continental conservative who thinks that the spiritual side of things is the place to look for guidance. And the other thing that that is being said here is something like that the political, or even the political and the scientific, is not going to help. It's because it is viewed as being symptom, not cause. And looking there for solutions is misunderstanding the nature of what is happening and also the nature of how these things operate or occur. He talks at various places here about ethics as a mere imperative is helpless without, right? These sorts of formulations. So there's no question that there is a particular understanding of what matters in the broad sweep of history here, which is at the basis of all of these claims and all this brush clearing. The fact that the things he's clearing are to him brush, when to most of the world they are world-shaking events of the of searing pain and importance, right? Is a perspective which is somewhat alien. It's a perspective which is can seem isolated. You get the point, right? There's issues with it. That doesn't mean that there isn't also some truth to it, in the sense that it may be that some of these events of the scale that he's talking about do happen for, if I can put it this way, cultural and philosophical reasons that happen on the level that he's talking about. But that contrast in levels is what he's getting at here over and over again, right? He's trying to pull people away from the thinking about things as being about recent events, the news, power politics, which party, right? And down to the level of philosophical interpretations of what is, spiritual relationships to truth, something like that, where he thinks the actual important relations / questions both are and are decided, right? So if a wasteland is growing, it's not because of a political event, anything like that. So I don't know if that helps, but in much of that, he is, some of that understanding of where these things occur, how these things are important, is something that he does share with Nietzsche. Nietzsche also has that sense of what are the important driving forces in history. Nietzsche might put it on this as something like, the history of moralities or something like that, which is more of a moral frame on it than Heidegger would put on it. Heidegger would think of it as different understandings of truth. But in either event, they both think that there's something that happens on the philosophical level, of which even the largest civilizational forces and consequences are just downstream byproducts, right? That's what's going on when he talks about how he quotes Nietzsche as, thoughts that come on dove's feet guide the world. It is the stillest words that bring on the storm, right? So he's trying to point out that these at the level of this sort of philosophical and semi-spiritual thought, right? That changes in man's relationship or understanding of truth occur, and that things as big as the period between Nietzsche and his own day, and everything, all the turmoil that happened in that, are the result of those sorts of things. What's the proof of that? The proof of that is that Nietzsche is the prophet of all that happening, right? He's not the only one, but Nietzsche will tell you, in the 1870s and 1880s, that the 20th century will be the age of world wars leading up to the dominion of the earth, and that these will be fought in the name of fundamental philosophical doctrines, right? And he says that at a time when there's universal peace reigning in Europe, a very long peace. Belief in unlimited progress through science and technology is the uniform faith of most of mankind, right? And nobody is untrue. Most people around don't see anything like that sort of disaster coming, and he does, right? Why does he see that coming? He sees that coming because he sees a change in the fundamental understanding of relation to being and morality going on in the European peoples of his time. The cultural underpinnings that are holding up the social structure around him don't exist anymore. The people living in them don't believe the things that made those institutions. They believe other things now, and he knows that their institutions are therefore going to change, right? And that's a matter of seeing that change on that cultural level is going to drive those institutional, political, and social changes, which are downstream of it. If people believe entirely differently, they will not peacefully, happily live in institutions that were created within an entirely different set of beliefs, worldview, etc. So does that help?
Yeah, that's super helpful. So like what Heidegger at one point says that as soon as in the history of being, as soon as techne was privileged, the atom bomb had already gone off, right? It was like the future was already fulfilled as soon as the privileging of techne happened. And is so when you say, for example, the world decided nothing, that's because fundamentally what's happening is there's a misunderstanding of being, where this kind of calculative technological privileging of a way of relating to being, it only leads to these kinds of world events, which are more symptoms than they are anything else. And there's something more originary happening,
Yes.
which is a misunderstanding of being.
Yeah, and I mean, yes, that is what he's saying. I mean, one could argue that the Second World War did decide something, and that he's underselling it. But what he says is that it only what remains to be left to be decided stands out a little more clearly. He's saying something like, the dominion of the earth has not been decided, but now we've got a war between two things instead of three things, or something like that. In the same prophecy of the world wars that Nietzsche had laid out. Remember, in '52, it didn't look like the wars were over, right? It looked like the next one could happen at any time. So there's a little bit of a nod in that direction. So what is left undecided stands out a little more clearly. So there's a few fewer players on the field, but what those players are or represent metaphysically hasn't changed. It's still the same ideological power systems that Nietzsche diagnoses as what modern philosophy will create. People who believe what modern philosophy teaches will view their cultural and social institutions as mere means for power accumulation of this or that, representatives of this or that set of will and drives, right? That's why Nietzsche thinks ideological party politics is what it is. That from Nietzsche's point of view, that's just a manifestation of his understanding of will to power. And from Heidegger's point of view, he's saying Nietzsche doesn't look like he's wrong about that in terms of how we're actually living. That doesn't mean that that's necessary from Heidegger's point of view, but he does think that it's an accurate diagnosis of the period from Nietzsche to now, or Nietzsche to then, rather. Craig.
One other quick question in regard to this concept of techne. Sometimes I get a little bit disturbed when it automatically goes to the atom bomb. And yet I'm thinking about another person who was very influential at this time, Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, and propaganda and crystallizing public opinion, which is very much techne in my view of it. And as we look at what propaganda has done now, especially with the way our political world is going right now, it's in some respects maybe just as bad as an atom bomb from a standpoint of how it's influencing our society now. And it's completely moved away from being. It's all about power. It's all about control. It's all about selling.
Right. So, and you're right that it doesn't need to have anything to do with weapons specifically or physics of weapons specifically, and that the modern worldview or technological worldview is as much about manipulation of public opinion as it is about manipulation of atoms, right? But the operative word is manipulation, right? So we didn't pause to read the stuff from Questions Concerning Technology other than the Word of Nietzsche essay out of this, but there's some things in there which can relate to this that may be a little bit helpful here. So when he's discussing what he means by I think what he means by he's trying to talk about what he calls the spirit of technology, and he's winding up relating it more or less to Nietzsche's metaphysics in that essay, for those who have ears to hear, so to speak. And he says, so what is now when the age of man's struggle for dominion over the earth is openly dawning, and man is exalting himself to the posture of Lord of the earth? And his answer is that nothing is happening to being. and man comes to the very brink of a precipitous fall. Instead of being the orderer of the earth or the shepherd of being, he is becoming orderable standing reserve himself, right? So the point is, man is becoming a mere means because he views everything that exists as a mere means. So if man himself is a mere means, what does that mean? It means you have to find the purpose, aim, or goal that can justify and organize all the activities of mankind, in which man is a mere means. So you find in Zarathustra the image of, that is the book, the image of mankind as a block of marble to be carved, the notion that man is something that must be overcome. He calls it the yoke for 1,000 necks, the one goal that has been lacking, right? The notion that an instrumental view of truth winds up leading to an instrumental view of man, winds up leading to the idea that man is something that must be shaped, cultivated, manipulated, controlled, etc., reshaped. That is very much at stake in Nietzsche's philosophy and from Heidegger's point of view, the technological worldview in general, right? It is the farthest thing from man as an end in himself as you could get, right? Man has become pure means.
Yeah, so that with Bernays and our consumerist society, and everything is about consuming, everything about it is about having the new car, everything is about having something better than that. You could say that in many respects we have gone way beyond a sense of being into
yes, but you have to understand that from the standpoint of the Nietzsche's and the Heidegger's world, that's just a particularly shallow use of this man as manipulable, right? Calculating people's desires, informing people's desires in order to be able to calculate how many cars to build, right, is just one aspect of a general planning, which in principle you would use to calculate and inform all their desires, right?
Yeah, but in a sense, that is the one that is still very dominant, especially in our American culture.
I put it to you that the will to control more than just people's consumer tastes and to control all of their tastes and all their politics and all of their passions it goes rather farther than that. And we now have algorithms that seek to data mine it in real time, right? But that direction of things, that human being itself is turning into something like an orderable standing reserve for whatever purposes the machine of power accumulation sets for itself, right? That's the vision that Heidegger already had at the time of the question concerning technology and saw latent in Nietzsche's metaphysics. Dan?
Yeah, going back to this like events, what's relevant and what's not relevant for Heidegger. So these days I read several of those like physicists, and they have this kind of Big Bang idea, and they go back to like the first microsecond and try to explain everything that happens afterwards, like it was inflation or it increased very fast, and pretty much explain everything based on the first microsecond or something like that. And it's similar with Heidegger. Everything that happened, it happened there with the ancient Greeks. And when like something minuscule happened and roll and expanded, and it happened there, and it's everything that is related to that. Like when, I don't know, Plato and Aristotle decided that true is then a proposition, and that's ended up in current technology and stuff like that. So I think Heidegger is kind of thinking in those terms. Like for him, Hölderlin, for example, is more relevant than what happened in Second World War or something like that.
So I agree with the latter part in terms of taking it all the way back to what happened in ancient Greeks. That will be the second half of the book. We trying to engage with that. Here we're just sticking to the Nietzsche to now part. But he is seeing something in the Nietzsche to now part, which is Nietzsche still being in the general formation of metaphysics. It is an open question whether or not the moral and philosophical and civilizational problems that are being diagnosed as technology or age of the world picture, or the other things we're talking about, whether all of that is something you're going to get automatically from metaphysics, or only something you're going to get from the particular Nietzschean end of metaphysics, right? The latter is a defensible position. It's at least clearer that the Nietzschean end of metaphysics results in that kind of civilization, society, culture, whatever, then that anything influenced by Parmenides does so. There was a lot of culture in between that didn't look anything like Bernays. It's not obvious that you go on a straight line on rails with no branches or forks from Socrates going down to the marketplace, or Parmenides, writing a didactic poem, to modern consumerism or something like that, right? That they're too far apart, right? But that the place in which most of the driving decisions occurs is that history of ideas. That Heidegger firmly believes. He thinks Nietzsche agrees on that point. And I would go farther and say, when he uses the word thinking, that's what he's trying to say, right? The book is called What is Called Thinking. And we're going to try to understand what counts as thinking. And what counts as thinking is being alive, aware, and historically part of the process of the thoughts that matter on that level. And that's not a matter of their supposed determinism since, Parmenides or something. It's not about that. It's about that whole plane of those thoughts being something that one could actively be taking part in consciously and seeing what is happening there. Otherwise, it's just going to happen to you, right? And to the extent the book itself has a theme, it's to wake people up to that level of thoughts on that level having historical effects of this scale, something like that.
Yeah, I agree that that's the point, like awake thinking and be part of this and be aware, and yeah, don't let it roll over you and be part of it, but try at least to understand and see if there is something you can do. Or
yes, at least understand, face, and see it, right? We got several understands. Nathan.
Yeah, so because at one point Heidegger says that I think following Nietzsche, that at some point with Gestell, right, the standing, turning everything into a standing reserve, the world becomes a giant filling station, right? And I think it was Nietzsche that said that what will become is a total mechanization of the earth, something like that. So he
find that more.
foresaw.
Yeah, you find that more in Heidegger than in Nietzsche, but
okay, I thought it was Nietzsche that said that there will be a total mechanization of the earth. I guess my question is, like, if he did foresee that, his answer to that
from Nietzsche's
will.
Well, from Nietzsche's point of view, right, his answer to the question, is mankind ready to take dominion of the earth, right? That's the question he sets himself. He says, with what they're going to have from what science and technology are going to enable man to do, man is going to be called upon to assume dominion of the earth. And by the way, the reason he has to do that is not just science and technology. It's primarily because it used to be God's job. He's gone, so now it's our job. Right. So when it becomes mankind's job to have dominion over the earth, and it's no longer the job of any moral code supposedly written in the heavens, what are they going to do? Are they ready for it? Is man capable of taking on the stewardship of or rule of the earth? And Nietzsche's answer is no. Man around him is not ready for that. Man around him is the last man, and he's a manipulable consumer product, right? And a factory product, and he doesn't look like he's up to the level of what those capabilities are going to be. So the question is, can anything transform man as he is, what man would have to be in order to be worthy of and capable of exercising the role of steward of the earth? And Nietzsche's answer to that is the Overman idea, which we'll get to both here and in 9 and 10. From Heidegger's point of view, yes, that is lots more will, and it's not going to, it remains mired in the same calculative technological understanding that Heidegger thinks is the biggest part of the problem. There is no openness to being of any standard outside of man or beyond man in it. But from Nietzsche's point of view, that's the point. Nietzsche's point of view, right? What makes man the future steward of the earth is that there's nobody else to do it. Man is alone. That's Nietzsche's, fundamental attitude / point. And so that's a place where he and Heidegger are going to differ.
Okay. So Heidegger would say that we killed God and then we put science in the place of God, and then that becomes, if you want to say science in this broad kind of technological way of thinking, or
Yeah, I mean,
reason.
so the thing is, some people might have wanted to put science in the place of God, but the science they're putting there is too instrumental to carry on that function, so it's not going to. Right. This is the point that all of the German idealists saw. Right. You had to have something which was more will-like and morality-like, wielding anything like the powers of science or technology representation. Representation itself can't rule anything. Right. But I mean, that's just that, if I can put it this way, the 19th century problematic that all of German idealism, down to and including Nietzsche, is already just wrestling with. But Heidegger sees in all of that, he does see a will to power in all that. He sees metaphysics in that, but he also sees a lack of openness to being. This notion that there is no standard beyond the human will, or beyond the will. First of all, is will human will? We'll get to that. But the no standard beyond is a eclipse of being. Right, it's a cutting off from the being that should be subject to the communication that would inform what humanity does. So from Heidegger's point of view, that whole project, it reflects or is symptomatic of a prior large-scale spiritual darkening. Right, being has been obscured. People are not listening to being. And because they're not listening to being, they're thrown back on their own resources to make up for themselves what they think their goals should be. And as those goals compete with one another, guess which goal wins? Power accumulation. Because if the way that they compete is which can accumulate more power, power accumulation wins as the goal.
Yeah.
Well, this is all very good that we're getting into the substance everywhere, but I haven't given everybody a chance to give their opening statements. So, or their first impressions. Yeah. So I want to finish going around the table. Isabel. First, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's see. I'm just trying to adjust my camera. Okay, first impressions. Let's see. Here we go. Right, there I am. Oops. Oh, wait. Oh, it's all over the place. Okay.
First you see the top of your head right now, but it's okay.
Good, then you don't see my wrinkles. Okay. My first impressions are I liked very much what I'm reading. You also asked what is thought-provoking. Are you kidding? The whole thing is thought-provoking. And my knowledge of Heidegger is quite limited. Of philosophy is quite limited. I'm not a philosophical major. My major was French and Italian literature way back when. My thesis was on Dante Alighieri, specifically the Divine Comedy, specifically Purgatorio, specifically the Dolce Stil Nuovo, which is mentioned in Canto 24, or is it 25 or 26? And when you guys mention all these other philosophers that influence, even Nietzsche, I know nothing about, that influence Heidegger and who he is rebutting, I know not what you are talking about. However, I have one advantage what you guys don't have. I'm a polyglot, and therefore I do not understand him in English. I do not understand him in French. I do not understand him in Italian, and I don't understand him in Spanish. The wonderful thing about technology is that I can access all these languages and listen to these conferences and Zoom sessions in all these languages. And I get a little inkling here, a little inkling there, and a little perception here. But mostly what I'm saying is I am parroting more or less what I am listening to. My initial interest in Heidegger dates at least a good 20 years. The reason being that I had questions ever since I was a teenager. My question was relating to art, and I just couldn't find the answer. I went to high school and I went to college and I got my degrees. Well, I couldn't find the answer. Maybe St. Augustine a little bit, but Heidegger did give me at least acknowledge that what I was feeling existed, and he called me, and not only me because I'm not special, guardian of the arts. I'm a guardian of the arts. My question was specifically, where do I go when I listen to, in my case, beautiful music? I know that I am transported. I know it because I feel it. But where do I go? And another question, where does this yearning? I get these horrible yearning, almost to aching. I said, well, what is happening? So Heidegger is the only one. So therefore, since then, I have been listening to and reading and trying to understand what he is saying. I did read Being in Time, and just to show you how my brain works, in my effort to try to understand Dasein, I said, well, I can't understand exactly what he means by Dasein. I said, well, no, okay, let me transpose that to a different key. So I transposed it into the key of physics. Oh, yes, Dasein, time, space, no, excuse me, space, time. Okay, now let me transpose that into my grammar, which I learned in French. By the way, I knew my languages by the age of 14, so no glory to me. Analyse grammaticale, Dasein, noun verb. Yes, I understand. Oh, analyse logique, Dasein, statement question. So it is in this way that I am absorbing Heidegger, and also I feel that he's saying something extremely important, and I don't want to miss out. So therefore, I am here. Thank you.
Understood. So thanks. I mean, for things on Heidegger, on your question, Origin of the Work of Art, definitely worth reading. For other philosophers on it, Plato's Phaedrus and Symposium, I can recommend, who might be sources for Augustine. But okay, thank you. James?
Oh yeah, thank you. I was here for the last meeting, and I was looking forward to this one, and I did do the reading. It was a little bit, confusing, but thanks for elucidating the point that he was making, that the Nietzsche is doing a critique of metaphysics. At the same time, you're saying that Heidegger is saying that he also falls back into metaphysics with his idea of the Superman and the being of beings.
So, I mean, Heidegger is going to diagnose Nietzsche as very much remaining mired in metaphysics, and by the time we get through this sections 9 and 10 here, and he's going to trace he's going to outline how the idea of the eternal return of the same and Superman and the will and all those things are tied together and involve a particular understanding / reaction to both time and an understanding of being. So the question of being and time is implicated in the question of the spirit of revenge, or the question of the eternal return of the same. The eternity might give away the fact that there's going to be a time dimension here. But so that's sort of where we're steering toward. That's some of that, though, is for next session. Is Nietzsche making a critique of previous metaphysics? Yes, but he's understanding it not as metaphysics primarily. He thinks he's criticizing what he would call Platonism, and he's criticizing Platonism as a form of moralism, which is a kind of critique of the world as it is in favor of an ideal world posited behind it, and a critique of the world of becoming in favor of a world of being that is, hoped to be more unchanging than the world as it actually is. But those are, in Nietzsche's terms, he thinks of the thing he's criticizing not as metaphysics as such, the thinking that the thing that Heidegger is trying to get out of as metaphysics is definitely Heidegger's own framing. It's not, or his own analysis. It's not Nietzsche's. Nietzsche thinks that he's trying to get out of nihilism and trying to get out of Platonism, if I can put it that way. I don't know if that nuance helps, but does Does it
Also,
help?
it's I'm also reading Aristotle. Is that helpful for understanding Heidegger?
Sure. There's lots of things in Aristotle that are helpful for understanding either of them. But Aristotle is also a continent in his own right. Certainly, in understanding what Heidegger even means by the term metaphysics, Aristotle's metaphysics is critical for understanding that. But it doesn't just start with the subject matter that Aristotle is talking about in his book of that name. It's also the history of that, the history of back before Aristotle, of the same concerns that are talked about there. The question of what does being mean, or what do we mean by being? What are the beings? What do all the beings share? Something like that. That also has a history later, right? Which is not simply remaining on the ground originally sketched out by Aristotle. But certainly the reason that we, including Heidegger, calls this whole terrain metaphysics is it's the subject matter that Aristotle discussed in his book of that name, right?
Right. Yeah. So Aristotle's idea of the soul, that kind of is how he describes the soul as a complex relation between material and form. Does that help us understand what Heidegger means by being and beings?
I don't think so. I mean, the understanding of the soul you get both in Plato and in Aristotle, which is mostly covered in sort of De Anima. This is a from Heidegger's point of view, the stuff which he's going to himself understand as Dasein, and that previous philosophers in the West had understood as consciousness, or something like that. But what you're not going to find is that a single understanding of the nature of soul in Aristotle or Plato is a guide to something, either through the whole history of philosophy afterwards, where people are going to disagree on the subject violently, or in Aristotle, in Heidegger at the sort of far end of that tradition, right? It's one of the counters on the board whose understanding is being disputed, manipulated. It's not the key or thread that's going to unlock the relations among them. I don't know if that helps. The one place where you will get something from Heidegger's own understanding of metaphysics that relates to this is he will say that understanding man's essential nature, understanding being, understanding how the two are related, these are things that every metaphysical position must wind up teaching something about. Every metaphysical position, to be a metaphysical position, winds up having some doctrine of what is the basic nature of man, what is the basic nature of truth, what is the basic nature of being? How does something like truth happen for human beings, right? That's the terrain that a doctrine of metaphysics has to sketch out, or in later terms, it's the historical structure that defines metaphysics. Something which does all those things is a metaphysical position. But a lot of that was, really worked out, sketched out in Heidegger's Nietzsche lectures, and we're going to see only a single instance of it in sections 9 and 10 here, applied to Nietzsche. He's not really going to make the case that this is a structure that every metaphysics falls into, but he does believe that. It's other books where he tries to lay that out.
Okay, great.
I don't know if that helps. Yeah, Pete,
Yeah,
hand up.
Yeah, just a quick thing. James was asking, would it help to read Aristotle? And at the end of lecture 6, Heidegger says, it is advisable, therefore, that you postpone reading Nietzsche for the time being and first study Aristotle for 10 to 15 years.
Yes.
So there you go.
Yes. And this while he's going to do the whole lecture on Nietzsche, and then he says, but Nietzsche's too hard. You can't understand Nietzsche. First study Aristotle for 10 to 15 years if you want to know it right. Yes, so it should be helpful. He certainly did himself. Bruce. First, welcome. I don't know if you know the format, but with the format here is we're going around and getting people's first impressions. Did you manage to do the reading? Any first impressions on the reading? Any questions you have about it, or things you want to make sure that we cover as we talk about it?
I'm sorry, I got in late. Just signed in 25 minutes ago, and I haven't done the reading.
Okay.
So I'm just going to be an interlooper for today.
No problem.
Hope that's all right.
No problem. We definitely appreciate it. And feel free to ask questions if things that come up in the conversation, spark a question for you instead. All right.
Thanks.
Okay. So we talked about a bunch of and we already got into a fair amount of substance stuff, and I've already laid out a bit about, there's this big expectation of what's happening in 9 and 10, but I want to just recap a little bit about where we're coming from, where we're going to before we get into the 5 through 8, right? So where we're coming from. We learned at the end of the previous section that Heidegger has a problem with the overly subjective forms of modern philosophy, I can put it something like this, which don't leave open the, if I put it this way, the more obviously objectively true face-to-face confrontation of man with truth or man with being, something like that. And that thought heretofore has not left that relation alone as what it is enough, and has instead tried to shift that whole relation inside its mental or subjective pole, especially in modern times, right? So there's an underlying critique of modern philosophy as such that's kind of implicit here, and it's formulated in terms of what does it mean to form ideas, right? Heidegger's own understanding is something like man is the being that is always already open to being, right? So always in communication with being, always has an understanding of being. But the previous philosophy has understood this as man has an openness that is receptor-like, and that he receives things and he forms ideas, and the ideas once formed are in his head, right? So man is an idea-forming representational engine, right? And the question is the understanding of man as a representational engine an adequate understanding of what it means to say that man is open to being? Okay, so that's a where we're coming from. That's sort of before we even got to bring up this Nietzsche stuff, where the problem was left. It wasn't even obvious yet why Nietzsche was being brought up, but that was sort of the problem we were at. And then at the book end of our section, he's going to say, why is this spirit of revenge thing something about thinking or something about being? And let us learn thinking. That's the intro to 9 and 10. We talked about here how in 9 and 10, we're going to get an interpretation of Nietzsche's metaphysics that traces this spirit of revenge thing back to Nietzsche's basic understanding of what is and man's essential nature, and even the relation of both to time, right? That's what's going to wind up being truly involved, or the real problematic involved in anything like the spirit of revenge. And we got to the spirit of revenge because Nietzsche called it the bridge to his highest hope, that mankind be delivered from the spirit of revenge. That's the highest hope. And this highest hope is what he said Zarathustra is all about. Zarathustra is the teacher of the eternal return, but he's also that is what's supposed to deliver mankind from the spirit of revenge. So we get this notion that there was a mankind before he had Zarathustra, and then you have Zarathustra, which is making a transition to overcoming the spirit of revenge. And at the end of that, you're going to have mankind delivered from the spirit of revenge, which is, in Nietzsche's terms, Overman. And Zarathustra is meant to be the teacher of how you get from one to the other, but he is also the teacher of the eternal return of the same. So somehow the teaching of the eternal return of the same is going to overcome the spirit of revenge. That's the knot that's been tied here of what's the exposition that Heidegger is giving of Nietzsche's philosophy. Somehow Nietzsche thinks that teaching the eternal return will free mankind from the spirit of revenge. And for some reason, that is what Nietzsche himself regards as what is necessary now, what is the saving force for mankind, something like that, and is also the overcoming of this figure of the last man. So that's the basic outline of the piece of Nietzsche's philosophy that's being explicated here. And we have to be clear that when he's explaining Nietzsche's philosophy on this, Heidegger is not endorsing Nietzsche's philosophy on this, right? He's trying to explain to you this body of this person, this thinker's thought. And that means to go along the way with him and understand him. You cannot, according to Heidegger, you cannot understand a thinker's thought unless you're willing to go along the way with him and to think those thoughts with him. You have to be able to entertain them seriously. You cannot see how they fit together or why they make any sense to him. You can't pick at it from the outside. You can't take a picture of it and understand it that way. You have to think it. So anyway, that's the overall reason. And we talked about all the throat clearing stuff and getting all of the objections out of the way. But all of that getting out of the way is meant to introduce us to Nietzsche. Why are we being introduced to Nietzsche at all? We're supposed to be learning thinking, right? The whole lecture course is supposed to be teaching us what thinking is and what it means to talk about something being thinking. Nietzsche is presented as a thinker, as someone who is acting on this level. And we're going to learn thinking by being able to think his thoughts and maybe think beyond his thoughts. Maybe being able to think through his thoughts to a position of freedom or clarity that can stand independent of his thoughts. That's the overall goal that's being presented here and why it's being brought up. But we just heard that there's all this too much subjectivism in modern philosophy, and then we went immediately to Nietzsche. Why? Because that's the kind of philosophy Nietzsche has. Nietzsche tells us that the world viewed from inside would be will to power and nothing else, which means that the will to power doctrine is meant to be the world viewed from inside. The world viewed from the standpoint of the consciousness, from the standpoint of the drives. That's what Nietzsche's whole philosophy is kind of about. And we talked a little bit earlier about why that would be so, because this representation view of the mind views the mind as subordinate to the drives, right? There is the mind that only performs representational functions, but is performing those functions for a whole animal, a whole person, and that whole animal is has its needs and drives, which are best understood as will. Why are they understood as will? Because they're not just personal. There's something which the individual human being inherits from humanity itself and even from life itself, right? There's a deep and underlying nature or force in these things that is bigger than individual human beings and merely passes through them, and of which they are merely instances. Okay, so that's the overall reason why there's something that bugs Heidegger about subjectivism in modern philosophy is leading us through this exposition of Nietzsche. And all of that is meant to help us understand what thinking is. First of all, any questions about that? Just general layering of those levels. What's the thinking level? Why are we talking about Nietzsche at all? What fundamental objection, if any, has Heidegger already pointed to that he might have with Nietzsche? I'm looking for reactions or questions about any of that. If everyone is quiet, I'll assume that everyone got it the first time, but I don't believe it. Dan?
I just want to say,
Oh, sorry,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead, Isabel.
I just want to say that way back, I've been listening to your broadcast, Jason, that way back when you were talking about Nietzsche, God is dead, that I noticed from the get-go that Heidegger appropriates Nietzsche, because the title of his essay is Nietzsche's word, God is dead. Well, God is dead is not a word. It's a series of words. It's a statement. It's a saying. And then I went to the German. By the way, I'm studying German in Duolingo. Hope I'll be able to at least master a little bit of it. But anyway, it's the same in German. So right from the get-go, without us even noticing, Heidegger is appropriating him into a kind of God is dead, as if it were a God dash is dash dead. Heidegger does that, but not Nietzsche. Anyway, that's my impression. Thank you.
I don't think when he says a word that he means a single word. I mean, someone having their word is something which we say of prophets in general, where their word is their teaching. So that's just a colloquialism to me. It's not meant to be taken literally as one word or three. So it's fine. Dan, you had a thought or comment?
Yeah, I think I want to mention something like going back to Isabel and the German title of this book. I think we never mentioned this, but my understanding is it means two things. It's what is called thinking and also what calls thinking. So it's that double sense there that it's.
So in part 2, all those double senses are going to be the theme. He
Yeah.
hasn't brought it up yet, but you're right. It's going to have multiple, but all of part 2 is about the not only 2, but like 5 different meanings you can give to what is called thinking. But yes,
But
you're right.
Dan,
There is a possible double entendre there. Yes, go ahead.
Dan, I'm not talking about this particular what is thinking. I'm talking about an earlier reading you did in Jason's Zooms, and where you studied Nietzsche's saying, not word, God is dead. And I'm not so sure, Jason, but I agree. You may see it that way. I would rather see Heidegger as appropriating, because he does that. You see.
I don't think he's not appropriating when he's characterizing God is dead as the word of Nietzsche. That's just a colloquialism to me, but it's fine. Dan, sorry.
Yeah, just to Isabel, it's just like I was going back to the original German translation of the title of this book. I was just connecting to you that you mentioned the German translation. It's not the Nietzsche's world. But it's I think we need to keep in mind that there are multiple meanings to what we should have inside here, and it's not just what is thinking, but also what calls thinking and a few other.
Yes, I want to underline that. I mean, Heidegger himself makes a point of that in our section, right, where he talks about how I guess he mentions in passing that any Platonic dialogue is inexhaustible, but the reason is that multi-voice, multi-meanings is the realm of thinking, and that it is the water in which thinking swims, right? There's if something is, and this is even goes back to the critique of mechanical reasoning, if I can put it that way, that we had back in the first section. If something has only one possible outcome, it doesn't get to count as thinking, right? It has to have this multi-directional interpretational freedom to count as rising to the level of thought, right? Things which are on logic rails to a single outcome are machines, and that's not what counts as thought. What counts as thought has to have this multi-voice, multi-meaning openness to interpretation. So yes, he himself stresses that here. So and we're already going to see that he's going to make much of that in chapter 2 in terms of the actual meaning of the title. But the place that comes up here is where he's just trying to warn people against attempts to have definitive interpretations of Nietzsche that seem to settle things for people or something like that, right? He shifts rapidly off the ground of Nietzsche to the ground of Plato, where it's going to be even less controversial. Everyone will admit that a Platonic dialogue is inexhaustible, and no one's going to ever get done interpreting the Republic, for example, right? But he's meaning that to apply first to Nietzsche, and secondary, he's using Plato as his proof text, so to speak. Okay. I want to ask the question. I just want to separate the levels first. There's Heidegger's framing, and then there's.
I just want to say something real quick here on
ahead,
the multiple meanings, polysemus. In this translation, it's multiplicity of meanings. And so he says in one of the readings this week for this session, multiplicity of meanings is the element in which all thought must move in order to be strict thought. Yes. So what you said, that if there's only one interpretation, we're not thinking.
Yes, and I would even say, interpretation is the word he uses when there is that kind of freedom and something else brought to it. But yes, interpretation happens because there's more than one. there's something that the mind, consciousness, or existence coming to the thing anew brings to an interpretation that makes it an interpretation. If there's nothing brought to it, it wouldn't actually count as an interpretation. Yeah, fair question. I was just about to say that I just wanted to outline that, but there's Heidegger's framing of where he's coming from, why Nietzsche is there at all, and the sort of things about Nietzsche's metaphysics he's going to. But inside that, we've got this already complicated thing of Nietzsche's own thought / doctrine. And I want to just jump down to that bottom level there for a second. I don't know if it's the bottom level, but the level down, leave aside the Heidegger framing for a second and just see if the Nietzschean understanding is that he's explicating here, if that is clear to people, because you can't assume everyone here is an expert on Nietzsche or has read all the Nietzsche he's talking about, right? So is this stuff about the a bridge between animal and overman that man is supposed to be? Is this idea clear? This idea from Zarathustra clear? And I just I don't have no sense of how foreign any of this is to people. I know that Pete knows this from lots of things. I know Dan knows this from lots of things. I'm pretty sure Craig knows this from lots of things. Joe might know this, but it might have be it was alien the first time, right? So I need to know how much of this Nietzsche doctrine itself needs explanation to people. Does anyone have questions about what last man means, overman means, what this bridge business is? Why is this weird figure of Zarathustra? What the heck is Nietzsche doing? Joe.
Well, I thought I'd understood the last man concept to be sort of the hoi polloi that surrounds us all the time. We have this imaginary idea of, the common man, and we can't possibly know enough of them personally to even form more than an impressionistic opinion. But an intellectual almost always has a disdain, or at least a sadness, because he can't really talk to somebody on the same level about the same deep idea. I like this idea of hierarchy. That the hierarchy thing that he introduced, I think, is very interesting, and that's part of one reason why I'm very eager to follow Heidegger's writings, is because I think that he's offering a more substantial understanding of what being is, what all life is, what reality is. So aside from that shallow comment, that's my comment.
That's fine. So good. We one way to understand last man as an everyman or hoi polloi or common sense or average man in the street, but it's also a contemporary man. It's a last man in the temporal sense. It's a most recent man, and the thing which characterizes the most recent man in Nietzsche's sense of it is their self-satisfaction, their smugness. They have invented happiness, they think, and they blink. Right, so they don't just believe in progress. They believe that they are the progress. That all of humanity has culminated in them, and they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And they have no faults of which they are aware. Right, something like that. So the self-satisfied person who is proud of his intellect, human intellect, proud of humanity's achievements in general. Right, Nietzsche calls this the person who has lost any longing to improve. Right, so someone who is completely satisfied with themselves is no longer trying to create anything beyond themselves, and this is the thing about the last man that bothers Zarathustra / Nietzsche. Right, is that he is a man without ambition. He's without ambition because he is satisfied with himself. He is satisfied with himself because he thinks he understands everything essential that needs to be understood about truth, and regards himself as the pinnacle of creation. Right, Dan?
Yeah, regarding to this, there is this, I read like a year or two ago, like Fukuyama, and it seems like it's quite popular in the intellectual, like academic circles, like this, they call the man without a chest, and like it's the battle between the liberal and the conservatives, especially in academic circles, and I think it's one meaning of what Nietzsche means here.
Right. So in the case of Fukuyama, he's referring. Fukuyama was a student of Kojève, and he's thinking of Hegel especially, and so the end of history. The end of history is, according to Hegel, arriving when human enlightenment has arisen because the correct Hegelian philosophy has revealed the truth of the nature of the concept to man, and it has resulted in the final ideal of the liberal state, which is the truly just social order. The universal and homogeneous state will universalize what was only implicitly realized in Hegel's day, and Kojev is all about that sort of a century later, that generalization. And Fukuyama thinks, yes, the Enlightenment into liberalism project of the modern era, right, both has succeeded, will succeed, deserves to succeed, and is the only thing truly needful or necessary. And in this, Fukuyama is channeling the ambitions of Kojev and the self-satisfaction of Hegel, but this is an explicitly Hegelian understanding of the nature of history as culminating in something like the enlightened liberal order, right? It's a Hegelian version of Whig history, right? When any of that is related to the criticized as the last man, right, the end of history, this is basically people are reprising Nietzsche's critique of Hegel, right? They're or of the self-satisfied European of his Nietzsche's own day. So the point is, there's a philosophical position here, not just a every man in the street. The self-satisfied person who thinks that the modern enlightened liberal order is the truth, justice, and the arrival of everything that was been the goal of history. That's the explicit teaching of Hegel, right? That's what he honestly thinks in his day and time. And Hegelians later have updated that to say, well, actually no, we didn't mean the Prussian state of 1805. We really mean more like the UN and EU and the Republic of Republics of that will establish perpetual peace or something like that as the modern liberal world order that Fukuyama thought had arrived when, at the end of the Cold War, the fight between communism and liberalism had been won by liberalism, and there were no fights left from Fukuyama's points of view. The last true ideological conflict had been decided, and in favor of the same enlightened liberalism that Kojev had been in favor of and Hegel had been in favor of. So that's the sort of reason that you see those terms being used in that sort of level of academic debate, is because there are people who are, consciously self-identified Hegelians who accept these labels from the other side without viewing them as being negatives, right? They view them as being positives. They're proud to be so identified. Does that help?
Yeah, and I'd like to make a comment or pushback. For Last Man, you're saying, oh, it was like oi polloi or common man. But Heidegger says, and I'm not sure if he's quoting Nietzsche, the last man is the one just before the overman. And only when you get to the overman can you then say, okay, that was the last man, unless you have, a lot of prescience and the overman's about to arrive.
Perhaps true, and certainly doesn't just mean the hoi polloi. It does mean the last in the sequence before the overman from Zarathustra's point of view, but he also regards it as the most contemptible. I will show you what is most contemptible, he says, but that is the last man. And then he also says the last man lives longest, right? So he's not expecting this to be a mere temporary blip thing, right? Self-satisfied modern man, to the extent he remains a self-satisfied modern man and gives up all ambitions for anything higher, fits Nietzsche's characterization there. It's not meant to be just a temporal thing, and that 5 minutes later everyone will be the Superman, right? The Superman is a project from Nietzsche's point of view. That the motto of it is, man is something that must be overcome, right? And that man is only a process on the way from animal to Superman, and it has to keep going. You can think of this in evolutionary terms. You can think of this in some transhumanists think of it in building AI terms. But the point is, there should be something beyond mere humanity if humanity is to be a striving thing rather than a self-satisfied thing. And the claim is that if man becomes a self-satisfied thing, he sinks back into the level of the animal, and he's just a particularly contented animal. That's the claim. Dan?
Yeah, I think Heidegger says that the Superman is not something that we take some attributes and take them further or take them to. It's actually something very big, goes back to the basics. It's very simple, and it goes simple in his terms. Like,
so he is trying to point to the fact that for see, there are a lot of people that understood Nietzsche in political and moralist terms, right? And Heidegger is trying to understand him in metaphysical and, if I can put it this way, almost spiritualist terms. And to do that, he has to contrast those understandings. So Nietzsche himself will say things like Caesar with the soul of Christ, and that is trying to blend a political figure and a religious figure, if at least no one noticed. So there's a definite political cast to that in Nietzsche, which is pretty much missing in Heidegger. He doesn't care about the political cast of it at all, but he thinks what people are missing is the fact that there's this metaphysical, redeemerist-esque, religious-esque, spiritualist-esque aspect of it, right? So he when he wants to say that people around misunderstand it, he says, don't look for it where there's the most will to power, climbing to the top of large organizations. Don't look at it from politicians. Don't look at it from pomp, right? It's a matter of you should look for it more like where you would find quiet saints and thinkers, right? Is effectively what he's saying, and to the degree that is a pointing people away from a misunderstanding of Superman idea, especially from the 30s and 40s and what was done with it then, absolutely necessary to point out what's actually going on in Nietzsche. But the particular cast on it, that it is, stripped of politics and stripped of moralism and made purely a matter of metaphysics, truth, and spirit, that's Heidegger. Because there's plenty of stuff in Nietzsche himself, which is very political and very moralistic, right? And is not shying away from those things at all. Doesn't view those things as lower in a sense at all. But Heidegger does. Heidegger has a level of contempt for those things, which, by the way, you do find in the early Nietzsche, but not so much in the late Nietzsche. When he quotes the little things about how there was things from early Nietzsche about he grew up as a plant in a churchyard, a son in a pastor's house, right? There's all these places where he's pointing towards the right frame to think of Nietzsche in terms of is this tradition of, if I can put it this way, German theology / philosophy, right? German idealist philosophy and German theology kind of blending together into kind of general German spirituality, something like that. That's the place to look to look for the spirit of Nietzsche or the spirit of Obermann, not in Caesar, right? But in Nietzsche, right, it's not a Benedictine monk with the soul of Christ. It's Caesar with the soul of Christ. So my point is that part of this is revision of Nietzsche himself, right? Nietzsche is actually still very political. So do we want to talk at all about the, I want to make sure we got the explication of Nietzsche first, because it's hard to talk about any of the reactions or any of the characterizations and mischaracterizations of it if we don't just know the Nietzsche doctrine itself. But if we know the Nietzsche doctrine itself, we can start asking whether or not Heidegger is fair to it here, or what we think of it. But before that, I think we already had a discussion about the losing part. Do people want to go back to the question about after you find me, it is a problem to lose me? Do people know that this story about what this was from? I'm talking about the section where he quotes the short note. This is on the top of page 55. I'm sorry, 53. The Epistles of Delusion, as he calls it on 52. Right? This is what's usually known as, or Letters of Madness. It's usually translated in English, right? The Madness Letters. To my friend Georg, after you have discovered me, it was no trick to find me. The difficulty now is to lose me. Signed, The Crucifies, postmarked Torino, for January 89. So this is basically in the month of Nietzsche's mental collapse. He wrote a number of these short notes with these weird signatures, including ones like this. And the occasion of it was off in Denmark, someone had started their first public lectures on Nietzsche's philosophy at an academic institution. And so Nietzsche hears about this and dashes off a note to the person who instituted the first lecture series on Nietzsche. Nietzsche now knows his philosophy is going to be taught in academically in schools, and his reaction to it is, okay, so you found out who I was, you found my books, and now you find me and you're having me be taught, but the difficulty now is going to be to lose me, right? And there's much can be read into that, and then the signature is it's signed to the crucified. It's not signed Nietzsche or Zarathustra. How much we made of this? What Heidegger makes of this is that there is a issue with any thinker of getting free of his thought, right? It's one thing to understand. You can be free of someone's thought in the sense of you've never heard of it, you pass it by. That's not really the same thing as being free of it, because then all the influences that it has on the world around you or on you still occur, but they occur completely without your consciousness of them, right? That is not a way to actually get free of a thinker's thought, right? The next way is you can understand them, right? And that requires walking a little bit in their path of thinking, rethinking their thoughts, and that can lead you to be able to see the world as they saw it. Okay, but that is not free of them yet. Even if it's not something that where you are trapped in seeing the world the way that person sees it, but it's voluntary on your part, right? That's still not being free of it. Being free of it is when you can see it and understand it as a definite thing that it is in its time and its place, can understand how it relates to you and relates to the world, and then can have your own interpretation and take on it, your own way of relating it to truth as such, to history as such. And that's what Heidegger is steering us to aim for with regard to Nietzsche. He doesn't want us to dismiss Nietzsche with a flip dismissal. He doesn't want us to imbibe Nietzsche and understand and accept him. He wants us to understand Nietzsche well enough to be free of him. Is that ambition clear? Okay. I think we'll only get the proof that he's done something like that by the end of lecture 10, but I think by then we will have the proof that he has done something like that. I would even say that his doing that becomes kind of a pattern for how a lot of people used Heidegger to understand these relationships between these grand meta-narratives or major blocks of history, something like that. It's not the same as the Hegelian understanding. Hegelian understanding is this dialectical, challenge and response sort of overcoming that leaves things behind. There's some similarity there, but what you're getting in Heidegger is a formula for understanding the positions of each metaphysical thinker and of metaphysical thinkers as such, that is meant to allow you to see them as what they are, but also be free of their controlling influence, if that's the right word. I would say that that section, although probably more in the form of the Nietzsche lectures than in this form, but the same operation/move heavily influenced people like Derrida and deconstruction, if people know about that or care about that. He's always trying to do the same thing to whatever thinker he's examining that Heidegger is doing to Nietzsche here, right? He's just usually doing it to someone like Rousseau or something, or maybe Saussure or something. All right.
Yeah, and just in that department, reading this part, you see where Foucault benefited from reading Heidegger, reading Nietzsche. When you get to the punishment and revenge and discipline, I can see that's where it set Foucault on his way to his career.
Yes, although honestly, Foucault is much more heavily influenced by Nietzsche than like Derrida is, and Derrida.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah,
But he
yeah.
got there through Heidegger.
I understand what you're saying, and you're not wrong. I'm just saying that Foucault remains much more heavily influenced by Nietzsche even after that. He doesn't. Heidegger or a Heideggerian or me might dispute how free of Nietzsche Foucault actually is in the end, but yes, there's certainly aspects of that which is common here. I think that some of the stuff that related to the punishment, etc., that you find in Foucault, he actually got from Nietzsche himself, not just from this reading of Nietzsche himself. Okay. We're going to get to revenge in just a second.
So I have actually a question about
Sure.
Understanding Nietzsche and his historicity about the will to power. I'm not quite sure if Nietzsche is saying that the will to power is now what was happening in the 19th century, after, that's the place that history had gotten to, or is Nietzsche saying that will to power was always the being of beings? In Christianity, it's also will to power underneath Christian morality, and
He is definitely saying the latter. For Nietzsche,
Okay.
will to power, the truth about the will to power being the operative thing occurring in history and being the truth of the beings at all times, that is Nietzsche's mature philosophy. He is not historicizing that, right? The thing which changes in different epochs is how conscious that is, and the thing which changes with him is that being something which is unashamed of itself, something like that. But that's the only sort of change / modern advent. Nietzsche would even understand Schopenhauer, his predecessor, as seeing that element of will in all things, but thinking that is something damning about the nature of being, right? So Schopenhauer first arrives at the notion that the world as will is deeper than the world as representation, and that will is deeper than truth, but that will is at bottom something which is in a Buddhistic sense that it's Buddhistic desire. It's the Buddhist desire that is always frustrated, the Buddhist desire that is doomed because it is at war with the world in which it is set, something like that. That's why you get this Buddhistic quietism in Schopenhauer. But so he sees the will, the restlessness of the will, as being the nature of life rather than being. But the nature of life is restlessness of will for Schopenhauer. And that's why life is something to be overcome, right? And you could even see some element of that reaction in Nietzsche in the amor fati phase or love of fate phase of the eternal return, which we'll get to next time. But the initial reaction of Nietzsche is that's pessimism. To see restlessness of desire as the underlying nature of life or being, and think that that is a damning of it, is nihilism. If it's the underlying nature of life or being, it must be affirmed because it is what is. And that is what Nietzsche characterized, or Zarathustra characterizes as the yes saying, right? There has to be some embrace or approval of the underlying thing being will, because it is the underlying thing. There is no other or outside to criticize it from. So Nietzsche is taking a perspective he learned from Schopenhauer, but reversing the moral weight put on will. Will is not a tragic Buddhist evil. It is something to be embraced, celebrated, and for living things to no longer be ashamed of. Everything living is will and has this sort of drive to a self-preference in later in older moralistic terms, right? And that is something not to be ashamed of for Nietzsche. And from his point of view, previous moralities and philosophies that were ashamed of it were nihilistic on that basis, because they were condemning something which is. They were against what is. Craig?
So can you do a quick contrast to where Kierkegaard was on this?
Good question. I mean, Kierkegaard does think that being at peace with what is and oneself as one is necessary, but he also thinks that that has to be grounded in. He thinks that's always grounded in being itself, as in something transcendent. It's never individual. Is a somersault like that performed by Zarathustra by the time he gets to Eternal Return of the Same? We'll see in 910. I don't think so. I don't think that Kierkegaard would think so. But where all of them are starting from, the reason that you get a Kierkegaard reaction to this problematic and a Schopenhauer and a Nietzsche, they're all reacting to this underlying nature of will teaching that you get coming out of original German idealism and people like Fichte, right? And so where will is understood as the interior of the self that views being as whatever resists it, and therefore being is something to be conquered. And in Kierkegaard, being is not something to be conquered. Self is something to be, if not conquered, reconciled with being that it cannot conquer. So the Kierkegaardian formula for absence of despair is being at home with oneself and at peace with oneself while being grounded in the power that established it. And that means there has to be a recognition that the self did not establish itself, right? And from his point of view, that is Kierkegaard's point of view, all of these individual will teachings are trying to deny that the self did not establish itself, right? They're not grounding themselves in the something larger. And that can even be a point where there's a commonality between Kierkegaard and Heidegger, because this, being open to being is something grounding that man gets his height, place, or dignity from being the openness to, or something like that. That's a point of commonality between Heidegger and Kierkegaard. It's a great question. Isabella?
Yes, Jason, in reference to the eternal return of the same, or the eternal recurrence, is that in any way similar to Heidegger's own always already there, which is a quality of Dasein? And secondly, is that similar to Giambattista Vico's the ideal eternal history? Thank you.
Good question. So less so on the latter, but I mean on the former. So the original idea of eternal return of the same is not directly related to just an always already. The always already in Heidegger is a formula for something which is a non-contingent structural aspect of human existence. So if something is structurally true, it doesn't depend upon some interpretation, events, particular revelation, particular understanding. That's where it's going to become an always already. And the already part is that later thoughts, structures, etc., depend upon it, rely upon it. In a way, this is an adaptation of a neo-Kantian formula for the conditions of the possibility of experience. It's an updating of that neo-Kantian way of thinking that Kant had for the structures of space and time. He's generalizing that to Heidegger is generalizing that to other structures that the life world has that are as basic to human consciousness or Dasein as the intuitions of space and time are for Kant. And his formula for that is this always already business, because he if anything has the character that it is that sort of always already, it has to have some, for Heidegger and being in time specifically, basic problems too, but more on being in time, it has to have some existential basis in the Dasein's constitution. There has to be something about Dasein, how Dasein is, what Dasein is, how it's made, whatever you want to put it, that requires that to be there. Otherwise, it would be contingent, right? Now, what's the relation of this to eternal return of the same? Is the idea of eternal return only trying to find structures which are invariant, only in the sense of, you know, the old Rush lyric, you know, changes aren't permanent but changes, right? The sense that you're trying to say the one thing permanent is change or something like that is there in the eternal return. But that's not the reason, that's not what gives the content to the moral content to the eternal return idea in Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, the eternal return idea is not just that there's some structures which are always there. It's instead some sense of the past having the characteristics of the future and the temporal having the characteristics of eternity, right? Which we'll get to when we get to 9 and 10. But the past is the over and done with is done away with if everything past is also off in the future in a cycle, right? Because it doesn't have the characteristics of it's only a past if it's in both directions. And similarly, if something recurs eternally, it doesn't have the characteristic of a once done and over and never again, because if it recurs eternally, it recurs, it's as eternal as anything, as the truth of mathematics, right? So this perspective or notion that there's a teaching which can imbue the past with attributes of the future and imbue the temporary with the attributes of eternity is for Nietzsche what the moral content, the weighty content of the idea of eternal return is about. We'll get into this in more detail in the next section, but I hope that helps. I want to get Isabel's reaction
Thank
first.
you.
Okay.
Yes, thanks. Thank you.
James.
Yeah, would it be also appropriate to interpret Nietzsche's eternal return not as the same, but of difference? In which case, you would not have a being. You have a multiplicity that is in recurrence eternally.
The saying is certainly not the eternal return of the different,
Yeah.
or the eternal return of the difference, which
Right.
wouldn't be quite return, right? In order to be a return, it has to be a return of something which shares something with the, there needs to be the re, right? For there to be a re in return, there has to be something which is the sameness to it. Just the fact that, you know, if you just had an everything changes, you would just have a Heraclitean all is flux, something like that. That's not the eternal return idea.
Sure.
There's a place in Zussbuch's Zarathustra where he's trying to give a little piece of his reasoning for it, and he winds up giving you a little piece of what we would later regard as the systems theory of finite state machines, right? He tells you wherever I found force, there I found number, for she has more force. And he makes a kind of argument of if you have finite possible states, you will visit them all, and therefore they will always return, right? So, and this is something which is, you know, true in general for just finite state machines understandings of things. Of course, it begs all the questions of, you know, is the time infinite and is the state space finite, right? If either of those things goes away, then you don't get the result. But it's presented as an almost tongue-in-cheek piece of evidence for the view that the only thing required for the belief in that any pattern that has once been will be again is the belief that this set of patterns is finite and time isn't.
Well, the only difference in the eternal return of difference, I think what's unique is that you're not going to have a being that is a static being, right? A static being that seems like
you would have to change what being means for that, and maybe in a way that Heidegger would accept, but not in one that Nietzsche would, because you would be turning being from something which is has the attributes of eternity into something which only has the attributes of actuality.
Sure.
But that would not be Nietzsche's thought; it would be someone else's.
Right. But how would you avoid, an interpretation of being equivalent to a God, which goes back to the static, metaphysics that he's trying to undermine. So
It's not clear. It's not obvious that Nietzsche cares about undermining that at all.
Mhm.
His primary goal in teaching eternal return is the same: is to deliver mankind from the spirit of revenge,
Mhm.
not to refute theism.
Right. But Nietzsche is critiquing the ascetic ideal. The ascetic ideal is this kind of dogmatism of the static.
Well, he's not necessarily connecting asceticism with staticism, and he even says that the idea that everything recurs is the closest possible approximation to the idea of being that a world of becoming can do, right? And in saying so, the notion of being that is being held out there is the Platonic one, and this is going to be part of why Heidegger himself will say, is Nietzsche overcoming Platonism, or is he reversing it in a manner that just replicates its structure one for one and has only turned it upside down and is still Platonism?
Mhm.
That's what we're going to be starting to get to. But this is all next section stuff. These are
Right,
fun
right.
questions, but they're all next question stuff.
Okay.
Next session. Dan.
Yeah, I think in the Nietzsche volumes or the courses, Heidegger says the will to power and the eternal return of the same stands for being. One is like kind of the what's essentia, and one is existentia. And for Heidegger is a kind of it stands for it's a substitute for being. But I think, as you said, for Nietzsche is more like a moral construct and it's something heavy and so on. And I think it was kind of funny when like Kundera took it and wrote that, where it took it in the lightness sense, but it's a moral concept in, I think, for Nietzsche primarily.
I don't know if it's primarily, it certainly is a moral concept in his motivations for it, but Heidegger makes a strong case that the reason he is driven to it is the consistency of the metaphysics, not simply a morals. And I'm open to that. It's possible that it's something which is like I'm going to put it this way, a free moral postulate of Nietzsche, but it is also possible that it is a structural requirement of the rest of his metaphysics for it to cohere. And if the latter is the case, then it's more like the metaphysics structure is having this thought than that Nietzsche is having this thought. And in terms of the role of will to power and eternal return, you're right that Heidegger lays that out much more clearly than Nietzsche lectures than here, because he has a pattern for every metaphysical position that it must have a doctrine of truth, it must have a doctrine of the essence of man, it must have a explanation of the being of beings, both as existence and as how, or the extentia, right? So and there the how that being is eternal return of the same, and the what that is the will to power, and the the nature of man in that is he is a piece of will to power, right? That's what he is. But and then the notion of truth that you get is that truth is the kind of error without which the human being cannot live. So that those four sets of things cohere as the metaphysical position of Nietzsche's philosophy, according to Heidegger. The question is, why does he need that? Why does he need that eternal return of the same one in there? And from Heidegger's point of view, the structure of metaphysics requires it because it needs to explain the standpoint of the whole structure to time. And if you left the other things there only, you'd have a will which has a direction in time to it. You would have a will to power, which is meant to have a notion of being to it, which has a presenceness to it. But you wouldn't have a uniting understanding of time, without which the being understanding would be, so to speak, at sea. So from Heidegger's point of view, Nietzsche required an interpretation of time consistent with the rest of his metaphysics in order for it to be a metaphysics and therefore to cohere for him. And it would have been incoherent and would not work as a orienting metaphysical map, so to speak, without the time element that he gets from the doctrine of the eternal return.
One more
yeah.
question. Do you think it's similar with what Kant has, like the objectivity of the object and so on? Like it's in the same line?
Yes, I mean, the only issue is this structure something which is necessary to thought, or is this structure something which is a historically supersedable discursive formation that we could think our way out of, right? And the latter seems to be Heidegger's actual position, but it's a promissory note. It's an aspirational other beginning that could think outside of that. All of the actual instances of thinking that he points to are in this structure. They may originate this structure, but he's not explicating 50 different, philosophies of the universe that are not metaphysical alongside a structure of metaphysics, right? He wants us to be able to think the structure of metaphysics in order to be able to free ourselves from it. But what he has in the way of thinking that is free of it is mostly just recognizing the historical temporal nature of this structure, right? So,
For Nietzsche, is the eternal return of the same? You said it's a time element, right? It's eternal time. So in other words,
yes,
not
but
a
the
change
person, so yes, but the person emphasizing that is Heidegger, right? Yes, it does have that aspect, but what Nietzsche is always, well, we'll see in the next time. But what Nietzsche is emphasizing about it is the fact that the eternal return of the same is the formula that enables the will to reconcile itself to time and its it was, because the it was of time, the past dimension of time, resists the will, right? So can the will be at home in the world, knowing that it cannot will backwards, right? Knowing that it is not all powerful, right? And from a Kierkegaardian point of view, the will should be able to conclude from this that it is grounded in a power that it did not make, and it is not omnipotent, and should give up its pretenses to the same. And from Nietzsche's point of view, the appropriate metaphysical doctrine will handle that. From Heidegger's point of view, he's more on the Kierkegaard end of that spectrum. There's a power that is being established in, but that power for Heidegger is just that you can't have a consistent understanding of being without having an understanding of time upon which it is projected, because that's an existential of human existence, that all of our understandings of beings are understood as projections on time, right? So if that's the case, Nietzsche cannot understand his will to power that's supposed to be the essence of the being of beings without having a time upon which he projects it and in which he sees it as living. Heidegger is diagnosing that. He's psychoanalyzing Nietzsche's metaphysics, right? To say, oh, here's where the structure of metaphysics required you to have to bring in your moral take on the time thing.
So
yeah, again, these are all great questions, but we should spend more time in the next time, I think, because we're trying to bring in things which the words that explain this in this particular case in front of us are right there in chapters, in lectures 9 and 10, at least in the case of Nietzsche. He's not necessarily going to give you all this sort of, can put it this way, this structuralist interpretation of it that I'm giving you, right? Which is more often the Nietzsche lectures, right? Yeah. But you'll at least see why you'll see him draw it out in one case. And the setup at the end of our current reading is when he's talking about the spirit of revenge, it sounds like the spirit of revenge is this, the teaching of someone who's teaching a moral repentance against something which is morally bad, the spirit of revenge. And it doesn't look like on the surface it's going to have anything to do with notions of being or notions of time. And Heidegger is going to come in lectures 9 and 10 and show you, no, actually it has everything to do with notions of being and notions of time. And he's going to advance that as having shown you what thinking is. Thinking is getting from spirit of revenge as something which looks like a bit of moralism in Nietzsche to being able to see Nietzsche had to think that way because being in time as existentials structure how human beings can think.
Just one more question relating to another philosopher. Could you think of Nietzsche's idea of this eternal return in terms of like Bergson's idea of duration? So it is like a flow in the process of becoming, of change and so forth.
So you have to be clear here, right? The notion in Nietzsche is not some recurrence. It's not some flux. It's eternal. He's got a notion of the entire universe going through a cycle, not little pieces of it having some persistence. The entire universe does the universe thing again, and then again, and then again, right? There is nothing ever happens only once. Everything that happens once happens an countable infinite number of times, right? That's the claim. And this is a vision, right? A vision and a moral, right? The vision is you can see the possibility that is how time could go. Time could go like a circle instead of like a line. But if time goes like a circle rather than a line in that manner, then there's also a moral. It changes the way you think about the present. It changes the way you think about the only happened once. It changes the way you think about the past. And those moral changes to how you think about those things are his actual motivation for endorsing the vision. And there's something to see in this in Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche views truths as instrumental for the purpose of man's drives. The eternal return of the same is no different. It is an untruth without which creatures like us could not live. It's a myth, right? It is posited for the sake of its moral effects and the moral ordering of man's life that would result from the belief in it, from Nietzsche's point of view. Dan?
Yeah, I want to say something. Like, I'm a statistician, and we have there are two perspectives. There is the classicist and the Bayesian one. And even if you observe a single sample, in one you assume that you can see an infinite many, and in the other one you see just one, and the implications are completely different. So it's kind of like here, it's circular or is linear. Is you believe in the thing can happen over and over again, or it happened only once, and the implications are quite different. So the point is, such ideas appear even in modern science in kind of different way, and with infinite universes or a single universe and so on.
Sure. They also happen in systems theory, right? That there are well-known theorems in the matter, but they turn on a finiteness that nobody has proved, right? So that's why it remains, from the standpoint of anyone like Nietzsche positing it, a myth, right? It depends upon assumptions you cannot know, or no one does know. Okay. So that was helpful because we're sketching out, why, what Nietzsche thinks and why he thinks it. We're going to see next time what Heidegger thinks about him thinking it, and Heidegger is going to try to tie that together with the ground Heidegger thinks that he opened up, explicated in Being and Time. Then we're going to transition to part two. Part two is not going to be about Nietzsche. If people's expectations there, we're going to go back to the Greeks, but we'll see why. Okay. I want to talk a little about some of the things which to me are a bit disturbing in this section. I've been explaining all the things I like about Heidegger's philosophy, especially in his structure of metaphysics understanding and so forth. But there's also things here where partly it's in the matter of dismissing some of the objections along the way. But there are, I don't know how to put this. Okay, look at page 83. We're early in lecture 8, right? He's going to talk about these happy last men, right? Despite this invention of happiness, man is driven from one world war into the next. With the wink, the nations are informed that peace is the elimination of war, but that meanwhile this peace which eliminates war can only be secured by war. Against this war peace, in turn, we launch a peace offensive whose attacks can hardly be called peaceful. War, the securing of peace, and peace is elimination of war. How is peace to be secured by that which it eliminates? Something is fundamentally out of joint here, or perhaps has never yet been in joint. Meanwhile, war and peace are like the two sticks that savages rub together to make fire. This is his characterization of what is going on in this age of the last men who are congratulating themselves on having invented happiness, right? But that are waging world wars on one another. So why is there something problematic here, right? Okay. To some degree, it's a simple moral comment, reflection on history, etc. But there's also a definite perspective behind it, right? There's a spin. This is not the perspective of everyone. This is the perspective of a continental conservative in Germany, who is criticizing the war to end all wars rhetoric of Wilson and the blockades that accompanied it. Similarly, when he is he's explaining what Nietzsche means by authority and institutions. The thing that makes an institution is authority, and there's something about that which it requires being anti-liberal to the point of malice, he says, right? When he talks about what the World War II did or didn't decide, he says he won't mention its fearful consequences for my country cut in two, right? Which he just mentioned while saying he wasn't going to mention them, right? So there is an undertone here of criticism of the modern world, liberalism, war, etc., all of which have the poor me attitude of suffering Germany has been traduced, right? This is not simply safe stuff, in my opinion, right? So I need to call this out when he's doing it, right? Did anyone else see or react to this? Pete?
So you're objecting to him calling the end of World War II peace, or
It's not the end of World War II that he's calling peace. That's not the issue. When he's talking about the elimination, peace is the elimination of war, that's not primarily about World War II. It's primarily about the war to end all wars rhetoric of World War I, right? And as for against this war peace, we launch a peace offensive whose attacks can hardly be peaceful. That is referring to Germany in the 30s, and the we is the Germans.
So he's objecting to, I guess, what you earlier called a Hegelian view of history, that we're headed in a particular direction, we're evolving to some end goal. And so here Heidegger saying, no,
that's not the part I'm objecting to. The point is, he is presenting the war peace against we launch a peace offensive that attacks can hardly be called peaceful. That's the place where he's condemning Germany's part in the matter, but he's condemning Germany's part in the matter as a equivalent and equally farcical reaction to a farcical claim that World War I was waged as a war to end war. So the modern liberal world of the last men proposes a farcical moral standard and tries to impose it by force upon Germany. And Germany reacts with an equally farcical reaction and condemns itself in the same terms. But second, I put it to you that he's presenting Germany as more sinned against than sinning in this respect, right? There's a whitewash here. There's a bias here. And you see the same thing in the fearful consequence of my country cut in two, and the Second World War decided nothing. Some of it is just I'm going to move to the plane of metaphysics on which all this political stuff is too shallow to matter. But when I'm commenting on all the political stuff that's too shallow to matter in order to dismiss it, I'm also going to do so with a bias that is not simply anything like even-handed, right? It is the perspective of a continental conservative in Germany who thinks that everything that the spiritualist Germans wanted to do was okay, but modernity is a crazy place where we're all led astray, and Germany also does all the evil things that modernity makes us do in reaction.
Right. Now I can see where, he's very disappointed because in 35, an introduction to metaphysics, he says, the world's now divided, basically between the Anglo-Saxon liberalism and Russian dialectical materialism, and only Germany
Yes.
has the possibility
Yes,
breaking
of spiritual
through that
renewal, right? Which is
metaphysically.
holding out as some sort of possibility there. And, oh, now after World War II, it didn't decide anything. Well, it certainly decided that spiritual renewal wasn't going to happen in a political form. Lane, question.
I think I understand your criticism here. Can you just clarify where Heidegger is not being even-handed and where his bias shows up?
So fair. So when I'm thinking of, in particular, at the beginning of that particular section, at the beginning of 8 was the first one that jumped out at me, and that was the one I just read. But let's look at it textually, right? So this is 83. Despite this invention of happiness, man is driven from one world war into the next. With the wink, the nations are informed that peace is the elimination of war, but that meanwhile this peace, which eliminates war, can only be secured by war. Against this war peace, in turn, we launch a peace offensive whose attacks can hardly be called peaceful. Right. So is he specifically mentioning countries there? No, but he's giving an order of events, right? What is being referred to as this, with a wink, the nations are informed that peace is the elimination of war, but that meanwhile this peace which eliminates war can be secured only by war. What is that a reference to?
Well, I think it's the Cold War, right? Because
No.
you can only prevent war by preparing for war.
This is not preparing for war. This is not parabellum. This is not prepare for in order to avoid. This is peace's elimination of war is can only secured by war, is the war to end all wars. This is the liberal interventionist Wilsonian 1917 rhetoric that was going to secure the peace of the world by the war to end all wars. And you got the same war against war rhetoric from the United Nations in World War II, right? And he's saying this is with a wink, right? He's tying it back to the blinking way of thinking that has just sort of some sham setup that is agreed to, right? But I hear here definite references to the story of what happens to Germany when the war to end all wars is waged against them, and then they react as he is condemning that reaction, but they react to that with their peace offensives, which are hardly peaceful. So he's saying that same contagion affects how Germany then acts, but he's also presenting it as Germany more sinned against than sinning because it is it first is the target of the war to end war.
Yeah. So he's a German nationalist, and he's not going to stop being one. But he's not a universalist for sure.
This is the point that I'm making. So I don't know if I answered your question. So the other places where you see things like this is I mentioned the right. This is on page 67 where he starts. He says democracy has always been the form of decline in organizing power. This is quoting Nietzsche here, right? In Human 78, I already characterized modern democracy together with its mongrel forms such as the German Reich as a form of the decline of the state. If there are to be institutions, there must be a kind of will, instinct, imperative, anti-liberal to the point of malice, the will to tradition, to authority, to responsibility for centuries to come, to the solidarity of chains of generations forwards and backwards ad infinitum, right? So at the end of that, the only qualification he puts on to forestall misunderstanding is that the Russia that Nietzsche is referring to later in that passage is not the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah, and there's a guy called Dugan who's making a similar argument.
Well,
Right
there you go.
today.
Sure. And borrowing from Heidegger to do so. Sure, sure.
Right.
So the point is that there's an element of this this framing, which is in 1952, quoting with approval Nietzsche's anti-liberalism to the point of malice, and this is not the same sort of even-handed spiritualist. The plane of metaphysics and truth is where we should be looking for the forces that matter most for determining this history, which would be fair and which I think anyone could see as being insightful about understanding why we're in an era of world wars, right? That if we're restricted to that, he would be on much sounder ground than where he actually goes. He didn't have to bring this up. Now, to be fair, maybe bringing this up is an important thing to point out about Nietzsche if he's in the middle of trying to explain away the misinterpretations of Nietzsche as part of just expounding him. But then he should have more in the way of clarifications than, oh, he wasn't talking about the Soviet Union when he said Russia, right? And he doesn't. Isabel, question.
Yeah, just an observation, Jason, but aren't you being a teeny tad, a little teeny bit too sensitive on this matter? Remember, we are so polarized now, and how horrible it is, what we are living through right this moment. But we mustn't bring that with us when we read, it seems to me, especially Heidegger. He's very close to the era that he's talking about, 51, yes. 52, very, very close. And so it seems to me that I don't see I would not be sensitive to that at this at that. However, when he goes back to the democracy is the decline, and if I can just bring Giambattista Vico back, that is exactly what Vico says with his ideal eternal history, whereby democracy is the beginning, is the corruption, the end. After that we go back.
It's not just Nietzsche. I mean, you find it in Plato, you find it in continental conservatism generally, you find it in Polybius even, right? It's a traditionalist trope, if you put it that way, right? So that part is not the part that I was reacting to. But I take your point that we should not bring our own passions to these things. I agree, but I am judging him by the standards of a philosopher, and he is purporting to show us that the correct interpretation of Nietzsche is to understand him on the level of metaphysics, because it is the thoughts on the level of metaphysics and spirituality which are determining these larger civilizational forces, a point with which I can agree. But he himself is in the course of clearing away the brushwood, he is not simply practicing what he is preaching. He is also still very much enmeshed in it. And maybe that's because he's so close to it. I think being that close to it excuses him less, not more. You can definitely preach against the spirit of revenge in Germany in 1952 and be doing a very good thing, right? But you better have the field of application of the spirit of revenge as wide as it needs to be on that date in that place, or you're going to turn it into something which has been cheapened into a comeback. Dan?
Yeah, I think you are right, but on the other hand, his entire philosophy was this kind of happens in history, and he believed that a second beginning is going to happen in Germany. So according to him, all that, I don't know, the German idealism and all the tradition was kind of for nothing, and like the end of war was kind of proving him wrong and showing that nothing happened, and all that he hoped that will be a second beginning was I guess falling apart for him, and he's showing that here.
Sure, but I mean, I understand that. I mean, I would say though that I think German idealism definitely did do something in Germany. I mean, in both directions, and certainly if there's any other beginning, it wasn't something that was going to happen in 1935. But if it's going to happen later, it's going to have to happen in a more spiritual way than anything that happened then, right? because otherwise it wouldn't even count as another beginning. But I compare thoughts like this to the kinds of things I see in other German intellectuals in similar traditions, right? When Heinrich Heine is talking about the reaction to what will be the effects of early German idealism in Germany on culture in Germany, right? He has the same kind of prescience that Nietzsche has when he's predicting that the 20th century will be the age of world wars for dominion of the earth, right? Plenty of thinkers can see these effects, decades ahead, because they are sensitive to the power that these forces bring to dissolving cultures and institutions. They know that cultures and institutions rest upon understandings, spirits, philosophical views, moralities, orderings of importance, and that when those things shake, a lot can shake with them. And plenty of other thinkers in Heidegger's own bailiwick, right, treat that with the moral delicacy it requires. I won't say Nietzsche always does. He sometimes treats it with bombast, but someone like a Heinrich Heine does, right? So I'm grading him by the standard of what I see other intellectuals aware of this do. And he's not living up to the highest standard there. It's not because he doesn't understand these forces. He does. He's clearly teaching people about them, but he's not living up to the highest standards that other intellectuals set for how you deal with forces like this when you're playing with them. You don't play with dynamite. This is dynamite.
Yeah, I don't know, because I kind of see, he's got his own position, and of course he's going to pick his own situation as grounding, because it gives him the level of real things that he grew up with, versus the German idealists who are being universalists and cheering on the French Revolution, and Napoleon comes through Jena and they all come out to see the battle, and they think, this is a reaction against spirit, or the traditional German values that the German idealists are opposed to.
Well, not all of them are opposed to all of them, but I mean, when I think of someone like Heine as opposed to, you're talking about, Hegel's reaction to Jena or something. I'm talking about Heine's reaction to the revolutions of 1848, right, where he says, you can see these things happening, but they're like nothing compared to what's coming from Germany. I see the changes that are happening in philosophy in Germany, and I know what changes happened in France after Just Rousseau, and I can tell you what's going to happen in Germany. And he tells France, if you see this happening, do not interfere, and above all, stay armed. Right?
Right. And so certainly after 48, the young Hegelians were, really important. And then Marx, so more universalist stuff that there's been this historical materialism that we're evolving from feudalism to industry and so forth. And this is a universal progressive thing. And Heidegger's coming from the opposite position and saying, no, being a Bavarian peasant is what gives you an authentic.
So if you haven't read it, you got to go find yourself the Heinrich Heine Religion and Philosophy.
I have not read that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Religion and Philosophy in Germany. At the end of it, right, he's explaining what's going to happen when you have, not Rousseauians that led to Robespierre, but you have armed Fichtians, right? And he makes some rather prophetic predictions, and he's spot on, right? So the point that I'm making here is, when people are aware of how these forces operate, they are capable of some delicatesse about it, and that's not a matter of which side they're on in a fight. Heinrich Heine is not. He's not saying he's on the side of the French or on the side of the Germans in this. He's seeing what happens to humanity, and I think to be fair, so Heidegger is doing that here too. When Heidegger is saying these people congratulating themselves on having invented happiness or waging world wars, he is commenting on the level of humanity, right? Not on the level of Germany or Bavarians, right? And to his credit, right? That's the same kind of activity, right? But I'm not grading him on a curve here, is what I'm trying to say.
Right, but you're saying he's ethically challenged by bringing this stuff up, and that's not a surprise. He was a Nazi, Of course, he's ethically challenged.
This is the point to bring up, right? It's one thing to be ethically challenged when you haven't seen what happened in 35, and it's another thing to remain ethically challenged in 52 in your first public lecture. This is the point that I'm making, right? And he's
not a good guy. Yeah.
It's not a matter of good guy. It's a matter of whether or not he is using the understanding he has of how these forces operates responsibly. That's the question. I think he mostly is. I think that these are quibbles, but they're there, and I have to call them out. In the same way that if he tells you that Nietzsche is not about the political, he's only about the spiritual things and the philosophical things, I'm going to point out that when he says Caesar with the soul of Christ, he didn't say Benedictine monk with the soul of Christ, right? He said Caesar. He's not unpolitical, right? This is a duty to truth, from my point of view. Dan?
Yeah, I think first this goes back to Plato, like he got the philosopher king and he got in trouble, and he didn't learn, like he wrote the Republic, and then but he continued to dream, like by mixing into politics. And Heidegger did the same here in a way, and he never apologized. He was banned, and then he was, after this course, after they forced him to retire, so to be quiet there or whatever. Sure. And
yeah, but I'm not trying to get into the rest of his biography. I'm just talking about the book in front of us, right? And the particular thing he's doing here is he's explaining Nietzsche, and to the extent that these are things which are in Nietzsche, that's one thing. But to the extent that he is explaining the last man idea by the history of geopolitics in the first half of the 20th century in Central Europe, right? He's choosing that as a way of explaining the last man idea. Right, he could have chosen to explain the last man idea by trends in art, or he could have brought up a propaganda. He didn't. This is what he brought up, right? So and it just has to be called for what it is. That's all. It doesn't have any larger conclusions. It doesn't mean that we can't understand and appreciate everything he can teach us about the structure of metaphysics as this historical thing, right? We should, right? But we have to notice the other parts too. That's all I'm saying.
And actually, as Pete said, there are consequences. Like we can look whatever happened in Russia and kind of blame Heidegger in a way for that. If want to run wild.
Yeah, I don't really want to blame Heidegger for that, but I mean, there's lots of other people to blame for it. But the things I want to blame Heidegger for is his actual acts in print. Right, not other things that might have happened, which I don't believe in the technologist's understanding of historical control of future processes enough to impute later historical happenings to what thinkers said, right? But the standard he himself has is, if questioning is a piety of thought, is that being open to what is truth, that should be the standard. And here we're trying to talk about overcoming the spirit of revenge. When we get to 9 and 10, I think he's going to have some sharp things to say about whether or not Nietzsche actually manages to overcome the spirit of revenge. Great. He's worth listening to on that point. Let's also pay attention to his own.
And just to clarify, so when we say the spirit of revenge, we mean resentment, right? Because we're not talking about getting revenge.
No. We're talking about resentment as it is understood in Nietzsche, but also what Nietzsche understands as the cause of that. And Nietzsche thinks that the cause of that resentment is something in the will that has a revulsion against an aspect of time. We'll get to that in the next section.
Well, okay, yeah, because yeah, okay. Let's talk about that next time after we read it.
Yeah. But yeah. Enough said. Okay, so I've gotten through the stuff I thought I needed to do exposition on. We've already done plenty of foreshadowing of the things that are going to be major questions in the next section. The next section is going to be really short. I wanted to be able to focus on it because I think it's critically important to understanding what this book does and what Heidegger is about. It's only 22 pages. We're just going to read lectures 9 and 10 of part 1, finish up part 1. I'm going to suggest as a time either the 16th or the 23rd of July. 16th would be in 3 weeks, 23rd would be in 4. I could do either one. It's a short enough reading. I think we could do it in 3, but I need to know people's availability. I realize that Craig, who might have some constraints on one of those, already had to leave. But does anyone else have a preference between 16th and 23rd?
July.
It's a short thing, so
You say 3 weeks.
Yes, 3 weeks from now on the 16th, or 4 weeks from now on the 23rd.
Yeah,
I would do either one. You prefer
I prefer
short?
the 4 weeks.
Oh, you prefer 4 weeks? Okay, 23rd. Okay.
Yeah, whatever. I'm good.
All right. If nobody else expresses a preference, the person who asked for 4 is going to get it. Right. So that's great. Everyone's pleased. All right. So we'll plan it for the this time on the 23rd with just the balance of part 1. I wanted to get that scheduling out of the way before throwing the floor open to people ask any of their questions. I realize we might have passed over something, or if there's a particular text you want to go back and visit, something someone said earlier, your own comments. Floor is open.
So I found something earlier about longing, and that kind of struck me, and I can't find it.
It's the part where Zarathustra is describing last man versus overman, and can the arrow of your longing, can the arrow of your longing beyond man, or is this the string of your bow forgotten how to whir? This is an end of 65, beginning of 6. Wonderful
Right,
page.
I thought Heidegger was going to make something of that. Well, why is he quoting this? I thought he then returned to that.
He kind of doesn't. He kind of doesn't. I mean, he mostly uses it as an introduction to the last man, and the last man is described as the most despicable man, the man who cannot despise himself, the man who does not know what is love, creation, longing, or a star. And he asks those things and blinks, and then doesn't care about doesn't stay for an answer. But the point from Nietzsche's point of view is, does man have ambitions? Does man have goals? Does man set goals for himself, or is man completely self-satisfied and content with what he is and regard himself as the peak of creation? And that contrast is the one that's being drawn here. And the arrow is longing going beyond man. It's not just having a longing in general, but that the arrow of man's longing go beyond man is the ideal being held out here. And there's an element of that which we can see as, just sort of hero's journey. Don't be self-satisfied, or you'll stagnate, or you'll regress. But there's another aspect of it, which is viewing mankind as a mere means to something beyond man, because you have to view everything as a mere means once you're a technologist, right? And those two views are sitting uneasily next to each other. Isabel? I see your hand, Isabel. You have a question?
Yes, I do. I couldn't find the button. I wanted to ask about what is thinking, and then was heißt denken, what is called for thinking. Could it be? Now you know what? My thought disappeared.
Okay, well,
totally.
I will say on that question, in part 2, which won't be the very next time, but the time after that, where we'll start up the lectures in part 2, is going to be very much focused on this question of what is called thinking can be what do you say thinking is, or what calls for thinking can be what elicits thinking, what brings forth thinking, or Do we have a calling to be thinkers? Something like that. All of those different meanings are going to be explored in the second half of the lectures in whole part 2 of the book. So right now, those meanings are sort of hung out there in the title of the book, but they haven't really been explored yet. But in the whole second set of lectures in part 2, he's going to get into that. He's going to start asking about the different possible meanings of what they signify and what we mean by the calling part, especially. Does that help?
Yes, but I remembered as you were speaking, Jason, my question. Is thinking, which we rarely, if not at all, do, it seems to me, is it a dialogue or a monologue? It seems to me that the thinking that Heidegger's talking about can only be dialogue.
Yeah, and he believes that. He agrees. Go
because
ahead.
the problem with our thinking, let's say not the overman, the last man thinking, is that he thinks monologue. He's satisfied with himself. He talks to himself, but the thinking, and I think it can only be dialogue.
I agree with you, and Heidegger agrees with you too. I mean, the particular way we talked about earlier about how multi-voice is the water in which true thinking swims, right? It has to have the possibility to open those things. Similarly, he thinks that thinking only happens when we engage in the conversation with the thinkers before, right? We have to. He's not even just thinking of the people around us now, but he's thinking of the dialogue with the great thinkers of the tradition is how thinking lives, right? It's a matter of understanding and going over the ground that other thinkers have thought in order to assimilate and then have our own independent interpretation and perspective on how they've thought. And if you have a chain of what passes for reasoning that has only one possible conclusion and goes on rails to it, then that doesn't get to count as thinking from his point of view. But yes, that is characteristic of the desire for univocity, as he puts it back when he's talking about the technology stuff. And the desire for univocity is also something he traces to an aspect of modern propaganda. So yeah, he's very much on the dialogue rather than univocity as where this has to live. Dialogue on its own is, pardon me, dialogue on its own is not enough for there to be thinking. It requires that the things being discussed and the level of what's being engaged in rise to the level of the history of truth, history of the revealing of being, something like that. There's a in what he's calling thinking, what he's using the term as a specific designator of, as a narrower thing than just, musing about something. It's a subject matter and it's a weight with which something is done, as well as this communicative manner that it has to be open to the thinkers of the past. It has to be interpretation. It's got to have many voices. So yes, hearty agreement on all of that, I would say.
I didn't quite mean that, Jason. I did not mean dialogue with a past philosopher, a past way of thinking. I mean, and this is why it's so close to monologue, I mean dialogue with yourself. Mm-hmm. And which is a little different than what you were saying, and I think that is that means that you question yourself, and that you see the necessity that yourself is not sufficient, both at the same time. Yet it's very similar to monologue. If I just may go back to my polyglot experience, in the Spanish Zoom, I don't know where, the man was the young philosopher was saying that following Heidegger's way of wording things, that in Spanish to think is pensar, which means to think, pensar. But he says that's very similar, and it has the word itself, pensar, has an origin which is, or similar root, which is pesar, which means to weigh. In other words, the thinker in this dialogue that I am talking about, not what you were saying, a dialogue with a historical aspect of someone else's thought, or but a dialogue with oneself, where the self, pesar, weighs one the other, no one, no the other. And well, this is that is this little difference that I wanted to make with the explanation you gave me, for which I'm very thankful.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I mean, in German, it's not the weighing; it's the connotation is thinking is thanking, which we'll get to in the second half. But sorry, I guess do James before Dan. James first.
Yeah, is that why he associates thinking? It's some of his other works with poetry and art, because art is open to possibly different interpretations and ways of thinking.
So it's not simply for that, but he thinks all of them are ways in which the human being is open to being and communicates with being, and being speaks to man. So yes, there's an element of that which requires some interpretation. There's an element of that which has this sort of freedom or openness to it, and that openness can, you know, come as a an undeterminedness. But all of those are things he cites as way in which man is open to being. So yes, but the thinking as one of the ways in which man is open to being is meant to be. The reason that he starts off by saying we still are not thinking is that he's making it something aspirational. He's making it something which is not a matter of course. I got up and I got out of bed, and, you know, I had 6 thoughts before, you know, I got to the coffee machine. No, that's not what he means by thinking, right? He's trying to use it for a more restricted, more elevated activity that bears comparison to things like great art or poetry, and that's this element of the plane on which it's happening, the as well as how it's approached, but especially the plane on which it's happening. Not everything that counts as ratiocination counts as thinking for him, right? Dan?
So is he saying that there's a element of creativity that must be involved in real thinking?
So he does not stress that it's creative. Nietzsche makes much of creativity. Nietzsche, you know, makes creativity one of his core words or something. What Heidegger stresses instead is the fact that there's an openness in it, which is listening to something besides ourselves, whereas creativity has the notion that it is something that we are expressing or that we're creating out of ourselves. The receptivity aspect, the openness to being aspect, like the passage of standing before the tree in bloom that we had the previous time, is emphasizing a dependence upon the world into which we are thrown and plugged, right? Not a primary dependence on the interior of our consciousness that creativity, as made much of in the 19th century, tended to stress. Does that mean that will it still have something like a multifariousness to it? Yes, but that's not what he's stressing. It's not the variety of it that matters to him. It's the openness to an outside that it has. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Dan?
Yeah, there is going back to thinking and communication, like in Ponderings, he says something like the meeting of a solitary one happen only in solitude. So it's kind of like he was a radical guy in the respect that staying there in his cabin and thinking and reading Kant and writing about Kant, that's thinking. It's engaging with being and with past thinker. That's thinking to him. And I think he was also famous for avoiding people and not traveling and avoiding all kind of like gathering and so on. And
like Heraclitus, but
yeah. And one more thing, there is one thing here that I really like in the book, and then we didn't cover, like on page 91, is that kind of a persona. And I really like that. It's like the persona, and that's like the last man, his actor's mask. And we mother main man, we always act at this personal level. Everything is there superficially. Is this kind of like what we show to other people, and we like what we communicate and what we say to each other, and eventually we think that's all that there is, and it's this communication and idle chat or whatever he says there, and then we get self-enslaved and so on. And
so I'm going to partly agree with you, but one thing to understand here is he is in the course of explicating Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is someone who makes much of persona. Everything deep loves a mask, so one of his favorite sayings. Nietzsche has a very positive view of masks, if I can put it this way, both for rhetoric and for other things, for playfulness. And Heidegger, normally less of one, right? He's normally about authenticity. Thank you for coming. So the authenticity concern normally dislikes masks. You also find that in someone like Rousseau, who made much of the bourgeois tendency to live in the eyes of others. You get that in Being in Time with the notion of the they. Normally Heidegger, Kierkegaard, Rousseau are all in this tradition of a deep dislike of masks, right? Nietzsche is on the opposite side of that spectrum. Nietzsche thinks that well, I mean, the most famous phrase is "everything deep loves a mask," but that human being is made out of masks, right? Almost, for Nietzsche. There's a sharp distinction on this, and it's almost funny that Nietzsche is, he's I don't know, funny is the right word. Not funny, haha. Funny, strange. Nietzsche makes much of honesty. He has a very confessional sort of rhetoric, right? But he's also perfectly willing to play roles, perfectly willing to manipulate, and perfectly happy to wear masks. He thinks of rhetoric as mask wearing, and this is part in Nietzsche of a rehabilitation of anything that he finds criticized in Plato, right? Plato condemns the sophists as fake or mask-wearing types, and Nietzsche turns that around and criticizes Plato as an actor, but then himself plays up actors. Yeah. So anyway, you can trace the problematic of actors through any of these philosophers, and you get a different take on them. But don't expect to have only one, where they're all against actors. Nietzsche is not against actors. Go ahead.
Question about just what we've read. Maybe I've confused with other groups. Because I remember we read a short Nietzsche one, but now I'm not sure if we read Who is Nietzsche Zarathustra?
We did not read Who is Nietzsche.
We read Word of God.
Word of Nietzsche, God is Dead was the one we read. The short one we read.
That's the one we read.
Yeah, we didn't read the Who is Nietzsche Zarathustra one.
Okay, and so that's the one I was recommending.
Yeah, no, it's a fine recommendation.
It's 1952.
Yeah, it's a fine recommendation. I mean, if people want more on especially as we get to the end of part one, if they want to continue on some of the things on Nietzsche, that's a good thing to read. There's obviously all the lectures on Nietzsche from earlier, some of which we've already covered on YouTube, but you can also just go to the books. But sure. I think we're probably not going to do that after this book, but we've got another 4 sessions.
I'm not saying we should, but that's also where Heidegger says that longing, that to understand longing with Zarathustra means it's not some willful thing that we don't have this, we want to get it, we're longing for it, we should, but instead that we find something missing. And so I'm wondering if for Heidegger, our sense of metaphysical longing is that we're missing being, because, in the West, we've forgotten it or hidden it. And there's a sense of longing there, that there's something missing. and that's being. And his criticism of Nietzsche is that he's still in metaphysics. He still doesn't understand that he should be looking for where is being in this.
Right, but there have been lots of other people from Heidegger's point of view, in the tradition of metaphysics who did not have that problem, right? Who were looking for being. But on the longing business, right? You have to understand that it's a deep philosophical theme all the way back to Plato and the Platonists, right? It's the understanding of eros in Plato, the love of the beautiful as being the way in which we attain to love of the good. The good is that which is lovable in itself, right? There's a whole Platonic psychology built around eros and longing, and it gets made much of even in the Church Fathers with people like Augustine and so forth. There's a background against which notions of longing get deployed, if I can put it this way. And similarly with will in the modern time, which is what tends to replace it, the note that is different in the classical eros and in the modern will is that the modern will tends not to have the notion of being intrinsically directed toward the beautiful. It has instead the accent of being free, right? That its endpoint is something which is decided from within itself rather than something which is determined from without itself. And in this regard, if to the extent that there is a longing that is always directed on being in Heidegger, that's a recurrence of the older ancient understanding that a properly oriented desire has an orientation outside of itself that is not determining from within. That makes it different from will. Will chooses its objects. Eros does not. Right? Just speaking of the history of in the classics.
Or the mythology of Eros.
I'm not thinking of Eros primarily as mythology. I'm thinking of primarily as the philosophical doctrine of it, rather than how the average man, the Greek man in the street, thought of as a little Cupid. I mean that Eros as longing for the good through the beautiful that you get in Plato, Platonism, Augustine, all of that, which sees the good as acting on and in man, with Eros being the strings that are leading man toward the good, right? It's a mode of connection between the idea of the good and the human being that it has from the outside directed, right? It's not something which is willfully and freely chosen and can point at any point on the compass and chooses 62 degrees west northwest, right? Whereas when you get to the moderns, that notion tends to be replaced by will. And thinking of Leibniz and Descartes and anyone in that era, they tend to have a doctrine of will instead of a doctrine of desire. In Nietzsche, you're starting to get a bit of both, but in the end, he comes back to will. Right? He does not make desire something different from will, where it has something fixed in what it's oriented upon.
Okay, if I suddenly disappear, my machine's giving me messages about out of battery.
Yeah. By the way, there are some signs in Nietzsche that there are things which he does think the will is fixed upon. When he talks about how the soul loves eternity and things like this, and some of this we even get implicated the next time we get into the time things. But on the whole, all the moderns, including Nietzsche, replace longing, or they regard longing as a function of the will, and they think of will as something which is in human beings, but also in life itself, right? It's something that we have because we are, right? That comes before us and passes through us, or something like that, that we participated in that way. And that's where they tend to put longing, is in that will. Dan?
Yeah, regarding the longing, like Heidegger, especially via Hölderlin, speaks a lot about homecoming. Do you think that also goes under the rubric of will and eros? or it's something different?
It's a good question. I mean, home is a separate notion for both Hölderlin and Heidegger that I think has all kinds of connotations for them. I don't think it's quite the same. It's certainly not the same thing as what the Platonists are getting at with longing a la eros. But it does have something to do with a notion of the one's own as being an element of the good that you also find in authenticity, that you also find in being a self. You find a little bit of that already in Kierkegaard. You find it in Spades and Being in Time. This notion of the ownmost as being essential to. There's a particularity that is essential to something being good, being lovable, something like that, in the Romantics generally, I would say, and that's not there in Plato, right? In Plato, the beautiful is so exterior that it is impersonal almost. It's not. It doesn't have the elements of ownness. Right now, it is certainly true that love tends to be attached to one's own, right? And absolutely, Plato recognizes this and makes much of it politically, etc. But from his point of view, the tendency to replace the beautiful with one's own is a limitation. He regards that as a slightly misdirected form of the attachment. Right? It should be towards the beautiful as such, not towards just what is one's own. And when it is instead towards what is one's own, it's a kind of a limitation by self-regard of this is attainable. So I don't know if this is the most desirable thing, but I know I can get it. So that ownness winds up inflecting or directing part of the attachment that should naturally be just towards the beautiful as such to the Platonists.
And just briefly, it goes back to the idea of what we started to lose once, like find Nietzsche and then lose it and then come back. And it's the same with homecoming. You go away from home and you return to it.
Certainly, you get that notion in both Hölderlin and Heidegger. I'm not sure that it's quite the same as the losing of Nietzsche. When you lose a thinker, it's losing in the sense of getting freedom with respect to. But sorry, James.
I wanted to ask if you can tie in this kind of will or desire with the vital impulse or the élan vital.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So would the élan vital be more like a will, or would it more be like a desire? Or
it's like a will for the moderns. I mean, the notion that of will as something which is not simply individual, but which the individual has because he is, or has because we are, and that is something which is more general. It's a principle of life itself that passes through us, right, and that has us as much as the other way around. That's something you get in all of the modern will doctrines, basically. It's especially noticeable in the notion of transcendental will. It really comes in with Fichte and Schelling. And it's there throughout the German idealists. It's there in Schopenhauer. It's there in Nietzsche. So in that sense, anything like a naturalist understanding of it as life force, what nature wants, anything like that is it's this. Yes, that's they would think about it. They wouldn't think of that necessarily as desire. They would think of it as life force and will. When Nietzsche says that the world as a whole, the human inside is will to power and nothing else, he's trying to say that this is a principle that all living things have, right? It's not meant to be a personal psychological a trait of this or that person. It's meant to be something which life itself wants for itself, right? There's a self-preference principle in life itself that is at the bottom of the drives of every living natural thing, right? So to him it's a matter of nature, but the matter of nature in it doesn't change the fact that it's will, and will is if I put it this way, a relatively undirected thing. The main thing that the will wants is that the will be in charge. To Nietzsche, which makes it very different from something which stably wants only the things which it objectively needs, or something like that. Does that
So
help?
is that metaphysics that would, be a kind of obstacle to realizing being?
Sorry, metaphysics, an obstacle to realizing being. I didn't follow.
Or with that, like this kind of will, is what Nietzsche is posing, and you're saying it is a metaphysics, right? And
Nietzsche's understanding of will to power is certainly a metaphysics. Yes.
Right. And so you're saying that the vital impulse, the desire, the modern notions of desire, are also, an extension of this kind of metaphysics.
Absolutely. They're
And so
taking a notion of life and they're making it a metaphysical principle, right? And if you can try to give that, you can give that a naturalistic sort of reductive or scientific evolutionary understanding if you want, right? But at bottom, it's still being used in the same orienting way of this is a metaphysical principle. The thing which really makes the difference between one or the other is whether or not the truth gets involved in it. If true winds up meaning something like important for or useful to the purposes of this will, then you're in the Nietzschean metaphysical position, right? If you have a notion of truth is something which is an objective scientific outside, and we just understand living critters as the things which have these particular drives in them, which are just little machines in them, which we understand as machines as such, then you might not be in Nietzsche's metaphysical view. You might be in some other Enlightenment positivist metaphysical view or something. But that's depending on whether or not you view it from the inside, or you view the will as real, or you view the will as just a word for a set of mechanical functions, right? Like a positivist might. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps. Yeah, because this French philosopher named Deleuze talks about machines as extensions of desire and production.
Yes, but he's heavily influenced by Nietzsche and also by Marx in the production side of that. But Marx famously understands production as man's metabolism with nature, but that's the sort of background that he's coming from. That so he's influenced by Nietzsche on the one hand, and Marxian notions of humanity as something which has a metabolism with nature that shapes not just the nature but humanity. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Isabel?
Yes, two things, will to be free and desire. Yes, but today, what rules is desire, because that is exactly what is behind our advertisement and our push to Twitter and all our social media to give us goals for us to desire, and hopefully the desire will engage our will. So, and just to put in my Italian background here, in Paradiso, in Dante, the desio e velle become one, desire and will become one. And about masks and Nietzsche, I quickly looked up the dates, and he's very close to Luigi Pirandello. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a playwright. Actually won the Nobel Prize, but he is very much into masks, and he too agrees that masks are not only good, but vital and necessary. And he has a short little story called Vestire gli nudi, which means clothe the naked, whereby you cannot take someone's mask away from them, because you take away their raison d'être, their meaning, the reason for that they are alive. So perhaps it is masks in that respect have a beneficial aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe beneficial to some, but what someone is without the mask matters to some traditions. Let's put it that way. I would just say thinkers differ on the point. On the issue of will and desire, and the old understandings of them, the extra moment that you get in the modern understandings of will is the notion that there's not just a freedom in it, but an indeterminism in its object, right? So from the standpoint of anything like Dante, right, a will that is directed at objects it should not be directed at is a problem, right? And from the standpoint of the moderns, it is not. The will chooses its objects to the moderns, and the moderns tend to think of the freedom to choose its object as being essential to the freedom of the will and being essential to the power that the will has as an actual power, because they fear that any direction of the will that is controlled by the objects from the outside renders the will a manipulated mechanical thing rather than a free thing, and thinks of that as strings or a form of enslavement. And so in terms of whether or not people's interactions with social media, etc., follows the model of the puppet strings or follows the models of will, I think most people tend to lean on the former side of that. The promise is behind it is certainly the latter, but I'm not sure if anyone. I'm not sure how many people believe it. Right? You can have whatever you want, but can you want whatever you want? Right? And will you want the right things? So those are the sort of questions that wind up being at stake in these things. But from the standpoint of the difference just between the ancients and the moderns, the ancients thought that stably directed, properly directed was essential to desire, and the moderns tend to think that that desire chooses its own objects. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So if we don't have, we have a couple more chats. I think that was just people dropping. I had to. Yes, okay, thanks everyone. I think we're gonna wrap unless other people have other comments. This was a great session. I thank especially all of our new attendees. The questions were great and the interaction was great. And please do come back. Glad to have you. And for next time, just the next 2 chapters of this, and I'll put something up on the calendar probably later this week. And then our session recording will go up on YouTube later tonight. Joe managed to get us to actually start recording, so we'll miss a little bit at the beginning, but that will just be for the people who are here then. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.